Evening hours of December 24th, 2011, so Christmas Eve, 26-year-old Zazel Preston sat on her bed in her little apartment in Anaheim, California, and wrapped Christmas gifts for her children. Laying next to her was her newest addition to the family, her third child, a 7-week-old little boy. This Christmas was a big deal for Zazel. It was also a big deal for her husband, 30-year-old William Wallace, not only because it was going to be the first Christmas with their new son, but also because this was the first Christmas after Zazel and William had reconciled their relationship. They had been married for the past 3 years, but over those 3 years, their relationship had been very unhealthy and toxic and at times abusive. But earlier that year, when Zazel had discovered that she was pregnant, this baby became kind of like a new anchor point for their relationship. It was like suddenly they could put their differences aside and just focus on raising their kids together. After wrapping her final present, Zazel hopped off the bed, she scooped up her little boy, and then she headed out into the living room where she met up with her husband and her 2 older children, who were little girls aged 3 and 8, and then they all headed outside and went next door to celebrate Christmas Eve at a party with their neighbors. Early the next morning, so on Christmas Day, Zazel's 2 oldest children, the 2 girls, they got up early and they rushed out of their bedrooms and they ran down the hallway into the living room where their parents were waiting for them on the couch along with their baby brother. The living room was completely decked out with Christmas decorations that the family had put up over the past couple of weeks. The Christmas tree was in the corner with bright multicolored lights and ornaments all over it. There were wreaths on the wall and other string lights around the top of the room. And then over their fireplace were all of their stockings nailed up, stuffed with goodies. The little girls squealed with delight and ran around the couch and took up spots right underneath the Christmas tree, and they grabbed their first present and they turned and looked at their parents on the couch and they saw their dad kind of give them a nod of approval, which meant, okay, you can start opening your gifts. And so the girls happily began tearing into the festive wrapping, and then after each of them had their brand new toy in hand, they turned around reflexively to show their parents. And so William, he sees the toys and he says, "Oh, they're so great, guys." And then when the girls, they look at their mother and they show her the toys, she doesn't even react. She completely ignores them. And so at some point, these little kids, they start yelling for their mom, "Hey mom, check it out, look at this new toy." But Zazel just sits there. She doesn't say a word. She's just sitting back on the couch, completely ignoring them. Finally, the 8-year-old turns to William and says, "What's wrong with mommy?" And at this point, William pauses, and then he gives Zazel a scathing look before very bluntly saying to these young kids, "Mommy got drunk, and now she's ruined Christmas." The girls knew from William's tone of voice that their parents must be fighting, and so they did what they normally did when this happened, and that was to just try to ignore it. And so the little girls, they turned away from their parents and began opening more presents, doing their best not to disturb their parents, who were sitting silently behind them. And then, a little after 9 a.m., after most of the presents had been opened, William abruptly stood up and walked into the other room and placed a phone call. And then, a few minutes later, there was a loud knock on the front door. The night before, after Zazel and William and their kids had left their neighbor's party and come back to their apartment, Zazel and William had gotten into a vicious fight. And by the time the kids had all gone to bed, the fight between the parents had become very physical. Neighbors would recall late at night on Christmas Eve hearing this very loud commotion coming from Zazel and William's apartment. And at some point, apparently Zazel had tried to run out of the apartment, but William had chased after her and hauled her back inside. The sounds coming from their apartment would eventually stop somewhere in the wee hours of Christmas Day. And then as the sun came up on Christmas Day, Zazel and William had made their way to the couch, and they were sitting there with their 7-week-old baby, waiting for their 2 oldest to wake up and come open presents. Except when their 2 little girls came out of their bedrooms and bombed into the living room to begin celebrating, only William was alive. Zazel had been beaten to death by William. And after he had beaten her to death the night before, he had dragged her into the living room, set her up on the couch to make it look like she was sitting, and then put sunglasses on her eyes in order to trick the children. And so all morning, as this 3-year-old and 8-year-old are opening these gifts and turning and showing their mother with excitement, she was dead the whole time. But at around 9 a.m., William realized his charade was not going to last because his kids were really keyed in to there being something wrong with their mother. And so that was when he got up and he called 911 and he told them that his wife had gotten drunk and fallen into a glass coffee table. And so she was hurt. And so a little bit later, the police and paramedics, they arrive, they go inside, and right away they can tell William is lying to them. There's more to this story than they're being told. And so ultimately, William would be convicted of second-degree murder, and he would be sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. As for Zazelle's 3 children, they are now being looked after by her parents. During the California Gold Rush of 1848, hundreds of thousands of Americans living on the east coast of the United States packed up their things in covered wagons and headed west for California to attempt to, quite literally, strike gold. About a year after the rush started, so in the winter of 1849, a group of about 100 would-be gold prospectors were on their way across the continental United States to California when they got lost in this totally barren stretch of desert, roughly 500 miles from their destination, which was San Francisco. They would spend the next 2 months driving around this desert looking for a way out, but they wouldn't find it, and so finally they just stopped, set up camp, and waited to die. But as a last-ditch effort, they sent ahead 2 of their fittest men to try to go out and find help. And miraculously, those 2 men would find help, and it wasn't long before the lost pioneers were going up and over this mountain pass out of the desert out to safety. And so as the pioneers are cresting this mountain, one of the pioneers turns and looks down at the desert valley below where they almost all died, and he famously said, "Goodbye, Death Valley," and the name stuck. While Death Valley has since become a very popular tourist destination for adventurous people, it is still truly one of the harshest environments on the planet. In addition to just being a big open desert, which presents a whole host of problems to any mammal, Death Valley also becomes one of the hottest places on the planet every summer. The temperatures soar to 120 degrees Fahrenheit and sometimes get as high as 136 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the kind of place where if you don't respect it, it will kill you. In 2005, a 35-year-old man named Robert Darmer, who lived in Los Angeles, California, decided he wanted to take a trip into Death Valley. Specifically, he wanted to go to the hot springs located in the northwest corner of Death Valley, and actually there's a nudist resort that is right around those hot springs. And so Robert wanted to go check that whole scene out. And so on July 26th of that year, Robert left Los Angeles in his Volkswagen van, and he drove north about 4 hours until he got to Bishop, California, which is a small town where some of his family lived. After spending the night with them, the next morning when Robert got up, he got back into his van and he drove south about 20 minutes to a town called Zurich, California, where he picked up Death Valley Road. This road covers the entirety of Death Valley, starting from its northern entrance, where Robert was, all the way south 140 miles to its southern entrance. And this road is actually basically a straight line. But off of this very straight road are literally hundreds of miles of unpaved roads that splinter off in all directions across the desert. And these roads bring people to other points of interest, like, for example, the nudist resort that Robert wanted to go to. So after Robert hopped onto the Death Valley Road at its northern entrance, he began driving south for about an hour, and then he began looking for the turnoff to the unpaved road that would take him the last 50 miles to the nudist resort. And so eventually, Robert believes he's found this turnoff, and so he gets onto this unpaved road and he starts driving for a while, and then all of a sudden his car just sinks down into the ground and it won't budge. It would turn out Robert had made a mistake. He had not turned onto the correct unpaved road. Instead, he had picked a road that led right out onto this salt flat. And so to the naked eye, it would have looked like the ground in front of him was totally flat and hard packed, and you could easily walk on or drive on it. But in reality, the surface of the salt flat is very brittle, and underneath that brittle surface is this thick section of mud. And so before Robert could realize his mistake, he had broken through the surface layer of the salt flat and got stuck in that mud. After trying unsuccessfully to get his van back out again, Robert realized he was in a really bad situation. His cell phone had no reception, so he couldn't contact anyone, and he was too far away to attempt to walk to the nearest civilization to try to get help. But luckily, he had packed lots and lots of water that was in his van, and so he decided the only thing he could do was just sit tight at his van, ration out his water, and wait for someone on Death Valley Road to look out and see him and come to his rescue. But after waiting for 6 days, no one saw him. And now his water supply was dwindling, and so Robert decided his only option was to abandon his van and make the walk to civilization. And so he packed up all the water he could, he threw it on his back, and he began to walk. And just like the lost pioneers of 1849, at the very last second, Robert was rescued. As he stumbled across the desert, his canteen empty, this group of teenage boys and a few adults who were part of this group called the League of Venturers were out in Death Valley doing search and rescue training. And so they literally turned onto the same road that Robert accidentally turned onto and then got stuck on. And so they came down and found Robert. And Robert, when he saw them, he was hysterical. He was crying tears of joy. He really believed he was going to die probably that day. And so the League of Venturers, they take Robert into their van and they drive him 80 miles to the nearest ranger station. And as soon as Robert got out of the car, he dropped to his knees and he kissed the ground in appreciation. I mean, this guy really was that close to death. That evening, Robert would hitch a ride from the ranger station back to Bishop, California, and the next morning, Robert spoke with a local towing company, and they agreed to drive him out into Death Valley to locate his van and tow it back out again. But when they got out there and they found his van, the towing company saw that the van was not in good shape. It had 2 flat tires, and there were several other mechanical issues with it. And they told Robert, look, we can't tow it out until the repairs are made, and we can't make those repairs right now. And so they left the van where it was, and they drove Robert back to Bishop. And then when they got there, Robert, who was quite handy with his van, decided he would just make the repairs himself. And so he went around town, he gathered up all the supplies he would need, and then that evening, he got a local young couple to give him a ride back into Death Valley. Robert had told his family right before he left that his plan was to go and fix his van, and then that night come back to Bishop, and then the next day, he would contact the towing company again, and they could come out and they could get his van out. But that night, Robert did not come back to Bishop, and the next morning, when his family still had not heard from him or seen him, they contacted authorities. It would take a few days, but the authorities would eventually figure out what happened to Robert. The young couple that gave Robert a ride back into Death Valley, they dropped him off at this intersection right off of Death Valley Road, where they and Robert believed was only about a mile away from that nudist resort that Robert had originally wanted to go to. Robert had told the couple that his plan was just to walk from that point. He would go to that resort and he would recruit somebody else to drive him the rest of the way to the van. He could make the repairs and that person would drive him back, and that would be it. So Robert got out. He said thank you to the couple and he waved to them as they drove off, and then he stashed his van supplies and then turned away from Death Valley Road and began walking along this unpaved road into the desert. However, unbeknownst to Robert or to the couple, the spot he was dropped off was the wrong spot. He was not a mile or less away from this resort. He was about 15 miles away from this resort, and the path was fairly circuitous, so even if he knew the distance, he likely would not have been able to even navigate his way there. And so after wandering down this unpaved road for about 10 miles, Robert left the unpaved road and began heading out into open desert, likely seeking water. Robert would eventually collapse and die just 4 days after he had been rescued from the exact same situation. When his body was found, he didn't have a GPS or a map or even a container for water. In late 2002, 25-year-old Jason Chase worked as a sheep shearer in an area called Gisborne, which is located in the northeastern section of New Zealand. When Jason wasn't working, he was often on his bike, cycling up and down the coast, preparing for his next road race. In early December of that year, Jason contacted his family, who lived in a small town called Dannevirke, which is located about 200 miles southwest of Gisborne, and he told them that he wanted to come visit them for Christmas. However, he didn't know exactly when he would actually arrive at their house because his training and work schedule were fairly hectic, but he told them, "Don't worry, I will be there at least on Christmas Day, December 25th, or a couple of days earlier." His family was thrilled, and they said, "No problem, we can't wait to see you whenever that is." And so by the time mid-December rolled around and Jason still had not arrived at his family's home in Dannevirke, his family wasn't concerned at all. However, that would soon change. On December 13th, a hunter was driving along the many winding back roads of the Ruahine mountain range. This mountain range, which is located about 8 miles north of Dannevirke, is a very isolated and rugged wilderness area that's full of steep gorges and gullies and very thick brush. And so as this hunter rounds the turn on this road, he looks up ahead and he sees there's a car parked on the side of the road. And so this hunter pulls up right alongside this car and he looks over and he can tell, there's no one inside of it. There's no obvious damage to the car. And then the hunter began kind of scanning around the area to see if there was some obvious reason someone would stop right at that particular spot. But when he looked around, all he saw was thick trees on either side, and the mountain kind of sloped down on either side. And so there was nothing unique about this spot. And so something just kind of struck the hunter as odd about this car. It just seemed totally out of place. And so operating on a hunch, the hunter would leave the mountain range and head into Dannevirke, and he would contact police and he would tell them about this car and where it was located, because in the hunter's mind, maybe someone had been reported missing in the area and maybe this car is connected. And so after hearing about the car, the police did not know of any missing person cases that were connected to a car that matched the description the hunter had given. But just to be safe, the police hopped in their vehicles and they drove up into the Ruahine mountain range and they went to the spot the hunter described. And sure enough, off to the side of the road is this parked car, and it's still unoccupied. After inspecting the vehicle, the police came to the same conclusion the hunter did, that there was no obvious signs of damage to the car that might have forced someone to abandon it. And then when they looked in the window at the gas gauge, they saw the gauge was full. And so the police kind of wandered around the area, kind of doing an initial search to see if maybe the owner of this car was nearby. But, there was no one there. They're in this very isolated part of this wilderness area. And so the police just took down the license plate of the car and they went back to their station. And when they got there, they ran the license plate number, and it turned out the car belonged to Jason Chase. When Jason's family was contacted about, why is Jason's car up in the Ruahine Mountains? Where's Jason? His family was pretty surprised. They explained to police that Jason had made plans to come visit them around Christmas time, and so they were expecting him to come this way. And the Ruahine mountain range, it is only 8 miles away from Dannevirke, so in theory maybe he stopped there on the way to their house, but they told police that just didn't make any sense. So as a precaution, the police decided to launch a search for Jason. And unfortunately, despite hundreds of people on the ground searching the Ruahine mountain range and helicopters overhead flying all over the place, no trace of Jason was found. And so the official search was called off right before Christmas, but Jason's family and friends, they continued to look for him. And on January 3rd, they would find him. One of the family friends who had agreed to continue looking for Jason after the official search had shut down was a farmer who owned a plane. And on January 3rd, as he did one of his passes over the foothills of the Ruahine mountain range, he looked down and he saw this bright red thing that looked totally out of place. And the pilot couldn't tell what it was, and so he took note of its location, and then when he landed, he passed those coordinates off to the ground team. And so the ground team, they made their way over to this location, which was quite far away from where Jason's car had been. And after making their way through some very thick brush and some very steep sections, they eventually walked out to this big open clearing. It was a dry riverbed, and right in front of them, in the middle of it, was the bright red thing. It was Jason's shirt. And Jason was still wearing it. He was found lying on his left side with his legs stretched out. He had on his bright red rugby t-shirt, some khaki shorts on, and he had no shoes or socks on. According to the searchers who first saw Jason in this dry creek bed, they would say the scene was very peaceful, and it almost looked like Jason had lied down to fall asleep. But Jason was not sleeping, he was dead. Jason had no visible injuries, and there was no sign of a struggle in the area. In fact, it didn't even look like Jason had been in the wild for very long, because his clothes were pristine, and despite being barefoot, his feet were in great condition. Despite a lengthy search around the area where his body was discovered, his shoes and socks would not be recovered. The only thing they found in the area was a water bottle that belonged to Jason. Adding to the mystery of what happened to Jason were the results of his autopsy. autopsy. The pathologist was unable to find any injuries. Jason also seemed well-nourished because he had food in his stomach, and he was hydrated because there was urine in his bladder. His toxicology report also came back negative for all drugs, medications, and a range of common poisons. The only odd thing the pathologist found during the autopsy was that Jason had 2 very small ulcers in his duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. According to this pathologist, these type of ulcers only appear from acute stress moments before death. However, these ulcers don't indicate what caused the stress. Typically, things like severe injury or septicemia, which is blood poisoning, will cause these stress ulcers. But Jason had neither of those. So at the end of the autopsy, the pathologist concluded that Jason had not been the victim of a homicide, he had not committed suicide, he had died from, quote, obscure natural causes. Interestingly though, the pathologist was able to determine with some certainty that Jason died on or around December 30th. Which means he was alive for the entirety of the official search for him, as well as the bulk of that private search conducted by friends and family. After the autopsy results came out, Jason's case was closed, and his family, despite having lots of unanswered questions, was forced to just move on. 15 years later, the same pathologist that had conducted Jason's autopsy was talking to a colleague about Jason's case. And as he was describing where Jason was found, the colleague suddenly stopped the pathologist and said, "Wait a minute, I think I know what happened to him." And it would turn out he did. The following is a reconstruction of what happened to Jason Chase. On December 13th, 2002, Jason left his home in Gisborne and began heading south towards Dannevirke, where his family lived. But before he got to his family's home, he took a detour up into the Ruahine mountain range, where he eventually parked his car on the side of the road. Once his car was stopped, he got out and collected his backpack and sleeping bag. Those were 2 items that were never discovered during the search or after his body was found, but it was later determined they were missing from his vehicle. And so after he has his pack and his sleeping bag, he also grabs a water bottle, and then he leaves the main road and begins walking into the woods, making his way down the mountain. He eventually would find a spot on the side of the mountain that he liked, and so he set up a campsite. What happens next is very confusing because we don't actually know why Jason actually went camping in the first place or when he intended to leave, but we can make one assumption. Whatever he was doing in the mountains, he planned on wrapping it up in time to still get to his family's house in Dannevirke on or before Christmas Day, December 25th. So from December 13th, when he first got out of his car and entered the wilderness, until December 25th, it's believed Jason was, by choice, out in the wilderness of the Ruahine mountain range. And so as this huge search is launched for him in the area he is in, it's entirely possible that he either did not see any of the searchers. This is a very rugged and heavily forested area, and so that's not totally outlandish. Or 2, even if he did see the searchers, he may not have recognized that they were looking for him, because remember, during that time frame, he didn't think he was in danger. He was out in the wilderness camping by choice. But sometime around December 25th, or maybe a couple of days before, when he needed to leave and go back to Dannevirke to see his family, after packing up his stuff, for whatever reason, he could not get back up to the road where his car was. Either there was some sort of physical boundary, or maybe he got lost. But either way, instead of going back up the mountain, we know Jason actually turned and began going down the mountain, away from the road and away from his car. It's believed Jason actually just decided he would hike his way out of the mountains. He was in great shape, very healthy guy, and he probably figured he could just hike the 8 miles to Dannevirke, and then he could have someone drive him back up and retrieve his car at a later date. But on or around December 30th, Jason was still out in the mountains. And at this point, he had abandoned his backpack and his sleeping bag and had most likely removed his shoes and socks for reasons we don't know. But he had managed to get much closer to Dannevirke. He just had to navigate a few more steep sections and then he'd be home free. And so on or around December 30th, Jason began slowly making his way down the mountainside until he reached a decision point. he found himself standing at the top of two very steep gullies that both would bring him down to a dry stretch of riverbed, and so either option worked. It just became a matter of which one is safer. And so after making his assessment about which gully he should take, he made his choice and he made his way down and he reached the dry riverbed. And it was at this point that Jason would have begun to feel a pain in his stomach. And that pain would have gotten worse and worse and worse to the point where Jason likely sat down on this dry riverbed, kind of waiting for the pain to subside, but it wouldn't. It would only intensify. And so as he's sitting there kind of wondering what's going on, his vision would begin to blur, and then he would start to struggle breathing. And before he could deal with all of these strange symptoms that were coming on really suddenly, he lost the ability to move his body and he slumped over onto his left side, and there he would lay until he died. It would turn out the gully that Jason had chosen to go down when he was standing at the top and he had those two choices, the one he chose, that one contained a plant called Urtica ferox. This plant, which is endemic to New Zealand, grows leaves that are covered in little rigid stinging hairs that contain a toxin called trifidin. And trifidin, in high enough doses, not only causes stomach pain and blurred vision and trouble breathing, but it also causes total body paralysis and even death. Jason, who, according to friends, would have known about the dangers this plant posed, likely just didn't see the cluster of plants when he was assessing which gully to go down. And so it wasn't until he was partway down the gully and was in these plants that he realized his mistake. But when he turned to go back up, it was just too steep. And so he was forced to trudge through these toxic plants. And because he was wearing shorts, his lower legs were exposed and they were stung repeatedly. And so he was dealt a lethal dose. The reason the pathologist was not able to identify this as Jason's cause of death is because the stingers on those plants, they don't leave any marks on the human body. And its poison, trifidin, is so rare that when they sent out that toxicology report, they didn't include it. They did not test for trifidin. And so it wasn't until 15 years later when the pathologist's colleague heard that Jason had been found in the Ruahine Mountains that the colleague said, wait a minute, have you checked for trifidin? Because he knew the Ruahine Mountains were home to clusters of that toxic plant. And so sure enough, they went back to where Jason's body had been found, and lining the gully that he had come down were dozens and dozens of those plants. The crime that would eventually put Timothy Evans on death row was horrific. But when you take a look at Timothy Evans's past, it's not really a shocker that his life played out the way that it did. Before Timothy was even born in 1924 in the southern end of Wales, his father had abandoned him and his siblings and his mother. And because Timothy's mother made almost no money, when Timothy was born, he was effectively born into poverty. As a young child, Timothy really struggled to learn how to speak properly, and then in school, he just really struggled to keep up with his peers. To make matters worse, when Timothy was 8 years old, he contracted tuberculosis of the skin on the underside of his right foot. This condition is not necessarily fatal, but it causes these large, painful blisters that take a really long time to go away, even with treatment. And because Timothy's outbreak was on the underside of his foot, it made walking nearly impossible. And so for a few years, starting when he was 8 years old and he was diagnosed with tuberculosis of the skin, Timothy had to miss huge chunks of his schooling to get medical treatment. And then other times he was missing school simply because he couldn't walk. And considering how poorly Timothy was already doing in school, these huge extended absences were totally catastrophic for his education. In fact, later in life, it would be determined that Timothy's IQ, which is a way to measure people's intelligence, was somewhere between 60 and 70, which is very low and put him in the range of having an intellectual disability. Not long after his tuberculosis of the skin diagnosis, Timothy would remain in school despite all of these absences and despite how difficult it was for him, but his real focus would shift from getting an education to trying to find work in order to help provide for his family, who were very poor. And Timothy was willing to do just about anything for money. For example, when he was only 13 years old, he became a coal miner, one of the most dangerous jobs on the planet at the time and still today. But despite Timothy's willingness to do these really challenging jobs that often paid very little, he would always eventually get fired, or he just would not get the job in the first place. He would be rejected. And always it was because either one, he had a flare-up of his tuberculosis on his foot, which made it impossible to walk, and so he couldn't go to and from his job, and so he'd be let go. Or it would be because of his illiteracy, and the job just could not take someone in that could not read, write, or really even speak very well. Or in some cases, like when Timothy tried to join the military when he was 18 years old and World War II was raging and all of his peers are going off to fight the war, well, when he tried to enlist, the military said, we can't take you because you are illiterate and because of your foot. This constant cycle of rejection and embarrassment really made Timothy quite cynical. He felt like he just didn't belong anywhere. And so at some point, perhaps as a coping mechanism, Timothy began to lie. He'd make up tall tales about the adventures he'd been on and all the influential people he knew and the superhuman skills he possessed. Now, most people who knew Timothy didn't believe any of the stories he told, but every now and again, some people actually did. And for Timothy, that little sliver of respect he would get in that moment, even though it was built on a lie, on an illusion, it was incredible for him. He didn't get that anywhere else in his life. And so he kind of became addicted to telling these lies. Fast forward to 1947, Timothy was 23 years old, and he was still living with his family, who had left Wales and had moved to London, and they were living in a very, very poor and dangerous neighborhood. At the time, Timothy had managed to get a job as a delivery driver and had yet to be fired from it, and on one of his daily routes around the city, he wound up meeting an 18-year-old girl named Beryl Thorley, who he really took a liking to. Now, according to people who knew Beryl, she apparently, like Timothy, had a very low IQ. And so Beryl and Timothy, they meet on one of Timothy's routes, and they immediately hit it off and they start dating. And by the end of that year, they were married. They initially lived inside of Timothy's family's apartment, but when Beryl became pregnant in early 1948, she and Timothy pooled what little money they had, and they got an apartment of their own. Their new apartment was terrible. It was tiny, it was dirty, it was located in an even more dangerous neighborhood than where Timothy's family lived, but it was good enough for them, at least at first. Once Beryl gave birth to their daughter, Geraldine, suddenly their cramped living quarters seemed impossibly small for a family of 3. And they were already extremely tight on money, and now adding a baby to the mix, they really just did not have enough money to survive. Timothy immediately tried picking up extra work wherever he could, but once again, his illiteracy and his foot, or a combination of the two, held him back. And so it wasn't long before the couple was forced to start taking out these awful high-interest loans that they knew they would never be able to pay back. So they are permanently saddled with debt. They know it. And these loans are only enough to barely get by. This is not enough to move out. This is only enough to stay in their squalid and awful conditions. And so as their debt piled up, in conjunction with all the stresses of being new parents and living in this really cramped space, it wasn't long before Beryl and Timothy's marriage just totally started to erode. It started with daily arguing over one of their many hardships, but it quickly escalated to full-blown physical confrontation that often was so loud that passerby outside in the very busy street would hear, coming from the 3rd floor, Timothy and Beryl screaming and yelling and punching each other, to the point where people outside literally stopped and just looked up, wondering what was going on up there. As Timothy's world seemed to just kind of crumble all around him, he at first turned to a coping mechanism he had used for most of his life, and that was just to lie about his current situation. He would tell people who would listen that he and his wife and his kid were doing great and everything was fine. But, behind closed doors, that wasn't true at all, and so that coping mechanism really didn't do a lot for him. And so Timothy eventually turned to alcohol to cope with his misery. But the alcohol would only make the situation worse because it was yet another thing for his wife to be mad at him about, and he was depressed all the time, and it was eating away at their non-existent budget to pay for all this alcohol. And so Timothy would turn to yet another source for comfort, but it would be a very unlikely source of comfort. It would be his downstairs neighbor, John Christie. And the reason his downstairs neighbor was so unlikely was because John could not have been more different from Timothy. John was nearly double Timothy's age. He was incredibly smart, and he was respected not only by his peers, but really by the community. And that respect came from the fact that John had served during World War I and been right on the front lines, and had nearly been killed during a mustard gas attack when he was fighting in the trenches. And then after the war was over, John would come back to London, and he would become a police constable for quite a while, and then after retiring from the force, he became a post office clerk. But despite John and Timothy's vast differences, there was one thing they had in common: marital problems. John and his wife Ethel had gotten married back in 1920, so 4 years before Timothy had even been born. But at some point early on in their marriage, the couple had split up. They didn't get divorced, but they separated and they lived totally apart for a while. But in 1934, the couple would finally reconcile, and that's when they moved into the ground floor apartment of the apartment building that Timothy and Beryl would move into years later. So, years later, when John is sitting in his apartment and he can hear coming from the third floor, like everybody else in the general vicinity, the sound of Timothy and Beryl fighting like crazy up in their apartment, John decided, with his experience with reconciling with his wife, that he ought to reach out to that young man, Timothy, and offer him some advice, or at the very least, be a friendly sounding board. And so John would eventually strike up a conversation with Timothy one day when they were passing each other, and Timothy was at a place in his life where he was looking for friends. He didn't have any friends. And so John, to come into his life at this point, was really good for Timothy, and so very quickly those two struck up a friendship. But this friendship was not really peer-to-peer. It was more like father to son or mentor to mentee, where Timothy really looked up to John. I mean, Timothy had never had a father in his life, and so John kind of became that. And John looked at Timothy with a lot of empathy. He could tell this was a man who was, not very bright, and he was in way over his head with debt, with this marriage, with parenthood, everything. And so John tried hard to kind of coach and guide Timothy as he navigated this very rough time in his life. And their relationship likely could have had a really positive effect, not only on just Timothy's mental health, but also perhaps on the state of Timothy and Beryl's marriage. But it was not long after John met Timothy that Timothy found out Beryl was pregnant with a second child. This was terrible news for Timothy. He knew they absolutely could not afford another child. As it was, they couldn't afford the current child they had. They couldn't afford anything. And in the United Kingdom, abortions were illegal, so there was no way to terminate this pregnancy. And so, totally desperate and terrified, Timothy turned to John for guidance. And John would later recall on the witness stand during Timothy's trial that, John did his best to try to console and comfort and tell Timothy that everything was going to be okay. You'll get another job. You'll take out another loan. It'll all work out. But, as John would say on the witness stand, his words didn't have any effect on Timothy. Timothy, by the time he came to John, was totally inconsolable, he was desperate, and he was unhinged. And so John started to suspect that Timothy might do something really drastic to make his troubles go away. A few weeks later, on November 30th, 1949, a very disheveled-looking Timothy wandered into a local police station in Wales, not far from where he had grown up, and he would confess to the police that he had killed his wife. He would tell the police that he had given Beryl a poison that was apparently designed to abort her fetus, but this poison was too strong and it had killed Beryl. And then after she was dead, Timothy said he panicked, and so he took her body and he dumped her down the sewer that was outside of their apartment building. And then he arranged for his daughter, Geraldine, to go stay with some people in London while Timothy fled to Wales. But after getting to Wales, Timothy said his guilty conscience was just too much, and so he turned himself in. The police immediately arrested Timothy, and they brought him back to London, and then once he was in a cell in London, London detectives went out to Timothy's apartment building, and they went to the manhole cover that led down into the sewer that was right outside of the apartment building, and right away they noticed something odd. They were not able to get the lid off of the sewer. It was just too heavy. It would move, but one man couldn't do it. And so after 3 police officers, they all got down, they were barely able to get this lid up and off of the top of the sewer. And then when they went down into the sewer, there was no body. There was nothing down there. And so when detectives went back to Timothy in the London jail cell and they confronted him with this revelation that, no, she's not in there, Timothy would kind of squirm a little bit, and then he would totally change his story. He would tell police that it was not he who gave Beryl this poison that ended up killing her. It was his friend and mentor and father-like figure in his life, John Christie. Timothy also told police that he left his daughter, Geraldine, in the care of John. Police are skeptical of Timothy, but because there's a child involved, they just immediately take his story at face value and they rush back to the apartment building and they knock on John's door, and John opens the door and he's standing there with his wife Ethel, and he's totally shocked at these accusations that have been lodged against him by who he thought was a very close friend of his. And John and Ethel would tell police that not only did they have no clue what happened to Beryl, but Geraldine had never been in their care. And so the police are immediately very concerned for Geraldine's well-being. Who has Geraldine? Where is she? But while they were there, they just did a thorough search of John and Ethel's property to make sure they weren't lying. And then after searching their property, there was nothing inside. But when police left John and Ethel's apartment and began searching the outside of the property, an area that they had briefly searched when they were there earlier, looking in the sewer, but now they're doing a much more thorough search. And during this thorough search, they find this shed that was located in the backyard of this big apartment building, and inside of the shed, wrapped in blankets, are the bodies of Beryl and her 13-month-old daughter, Geraldine. They had both been strangled to death. After processing the crime scene, the police went back to the jail where Timothy was being held, and they would tell him what they discovered at the property, and Timothy had a very muted response to it. And then when one of the detectives asked Timothy point blank, "Are you responsible for both your wife and your daughter's deaths?" Timothy would say yes. And then during a follow-on interrogation, Timothy would confess that he had been in a heated argument with his wife over money, and at some point during this fight, which got very physical, he strangled Beryl to death. And then 2 days later, he strangled his daughter to death. And then after dumping their bodies in that shed outside, he fled to Wales. Timothy would actually recant that final confession, but it really didn't matter because when he went to trial a little over a month later, the jury just did not believe that Timothy did not do it. And so very quickly, they convicted him of murder and they sentenced him to death. Just 3 months after his conviction, so on March 9th, 1950, Timothy would find himself sitting inside of the so-called condemned suite at Pentonville Prison in London. He was shackled to this table with guards sitting on either side of him in this very small cell, and then right next to him was this wall that kind of ran down the side of the cell, and on the other side of that wall was the execution chamber. And so as Timothy would have been sitting at this table, suddenly the cell door that led into the holding area would have flung open. The execution team would have rushed in and grabbed Timothy and stood him up before he could run or fight back. And then before he knew it, he'd be pushed over to the door that went through that wall into the execution chamber. Once that door was open, Timothy only would have had maybe a couple of seconds to take in what he saw. And it would have been this pale green square room with a noose dangling down from the ceiling, and right below it was an obvious mechanical trap door. And off to the side of the room was a lever that the executioner would actually pull to open up that floor and send the prisoner falling down into the pit below. So Timothy, he would have taken this in just for a second. His heart would have been racing, and before long, he would have been standing on this trap door. The noose would have come down. They would have tightened it to his neck. A bag would have been placed over his head. All the guards would have pushed to the walls, and then before Timothy could even say or do anything, the lever was pulled, and he dropped down into a 12-foot deep brick-lined pit where he would dangle by his neck until he died. This gruesome ending should have been the end of an already very gruesome story, but it wasn't. Not even close. 3 years after Timothy's execution, a man named Beresford Brown moved into the same ground floor apartment that John Christie and Ethel had shared. John had moved out just a couple of days earlier. And so Beresford, he moves into this apartment. It's totally dirty. It's not well kept. And so Beresford decides that he's going to fix the place up. And the first thing he's going to do is he's going to tear down all of the old wallpaper in the kitchen and replace it. And so he goes into the kitchen, he starts tearing down the wallpaper, He makes his way into the kitchen pantry. He starts pulling the wallpaper down in there. And at some point, when he pulls one strip of paper all the way to the ground, he sees towards the bottom of this wall inside of his pantry, where there are no shelves over it, behind the wallpaper, there is obviously a door, just a small door. It almost looks like the entrance to a crawl space. And so Beresford is totally intrigued. Why would there be this door behind the wallpaper in the pantry? And so he rips off the remaining wallpaper over this little door. He finds the handle and he forces it open. And what he sees inside of that little room would haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 years and 4 months earlier, when Timothy discovered that his wife Beryl was pregnant with their second child, Timothy really did go to his friend John for guidance. However, this is where the story takes a turn. When Tim came to John, who was medically trained from his time in the military, he would tell Tim, hey, I can perform an abortion on Beryl if you want me to. Timothy immediately thought this was a great idea. And so, totally relieved, thinking his problems are now all solved, he left John's apartment and ran upstairs to his own. He told Beryl about how John could perform this procedure for them. Did she want to do it? And Beryl said, yeah, let's do it. Now, we don't know exactly what happened next, but the running theory is that sometime in November of 1949, Beryl and Geraldine left their apartment on the 3rd floor and went down to the 1st floor, John's apartment. And when they got there, it was just John. John's wife Ethel, she was gone for the day. As for Timothy, he also was not present for this procedure, but he likely knew it was happening. So Beryl and Geraldine, they walk inside of John's apartment, and pretty quickly Beryl finds a place, or maybe John finds a place, to put Geraldine in the apartment where she's safe. And then John ushers Beryl over to this chair. It's like his makeshift medical chair, and he tells her to have a seat. So she sits down, and John goes over and gets this device. And now this device, it looks like a glass jar filled with clear liquid, and then poking out of either side of it are these black, thin, hollow tubes that come out and connect at this kind of makeshift mouthpiece. And so John, he walks over with this device and he hands the mouthpiece portion of this device to Beryl, and he says, here, put this on your mouth and start breathing it in. There's a gas I produce that kind of numbs the pain as I do this procedure to you. And so Beryl did as she was told. She took this mouthpiece and she put it over her mouth and her nose, and she began breathing deeply. And as she did that, John grabbed a chemical and he began slowly pouring it into the glass jar where these tubes were coming out of. And as he did that, a white gas began to form above the liquid inside of the jar, and there was a cover over the top of this jar. So the gas was trapped inside of this jar. And as Beryl is taking these big breaths through those tubes, she's sucking that gas into her lungs. And very quickly, as she's breathing on this apparatus, she didn't start feeling numb. She just passed out completely. However, this was John's plan all along. That device he made her put on her face, that was only designed to make people pass out. It was not to numb any pain. John was not medically trained. He was not performing abortions out of his apartment. He was a serial killer. So with Beryl now unconscious in front of him, John did the same thing he did to the other 2 women he had lured into his trap and whose bodies were now buried in his backyard. He began having his way with Beryl. And at some point during this assault, Beryl woke up and began trying to fight off John, but he overpowered her and he strangled her to death. And then after she was dead, John just walked into the other room where Geraldine was, and he used a shirt tie and he wrapped it around Geraldine's neck and he strangled her to death. And then after that, he put the mother and daughter together in some sheets and he put them out in the shed in the backyard. Later, when Timothy came to John's apartment to see how the procedure had gone on his wife, John would tell Timothy that, sorry, it didn't work out and your wife is dead. Don't worry, I'll look after your daughter and make sure she's taken care of. You need to flee London and go to Wales now. And so Timothy, without really asking any questions, would do as he was told and he would flee to Wales. But a little while later, when he tried to check in with John about how his daughter was doing, because he had no idea where she was or who she was with, John would just not let Timothy see her. And so Timothy eventually, just feeling racked with guilt about this whole situation, he went to police. And critically, when he spoke to police, he lied about what happened. He wanted to protect his friend John, who he looked at as a father figure, as a mentor, as a close friend. And so he said, I killed my wife. And so this is why Timothy got the location of his wife's body wrong, because he didn't know. He just guessed the sewer. And so that explains why when they got over to the sewer, not only was it empty, but it seemed totally impossible that anybody could have lifted this manhole cover on their own. It was too heavy. Then, after police discovered Beryl and Geraldine's body, and they went back to the London jail and told Timothy, that was the first time he found out what had happened to his daughter. Because to that point, Tim really did believe that John had just been taking care of Geraldine, or John had handed off his child to somebody else who was taking care of Geraldine. But either way, Geraldine was okay. So he's just been told she's not okay, she's dead as well. His whole family is gone. And so Tim was almost certainly in shock. And so he's sitting there with that sort of muted response as detectives are asking him, are you responsible for your wife and your child's death? And so Tim would say yes, but it's unclear if Tim actually understood their question or if he understood the implications of their question. He might have just been saying, I feel guilty about the fact that my family is dead. Not that he literally killed both his wife and daughter. But when Tim finally kind of snapped out of it and really began trying to tell the truth that John was responsible, nobody believed him because his credibility was totally destroyed, because the first thing he did when he went to police was lie about what happened. And when police dug into Timothy's history a little bit, they saw he was a compulsive liar. Everybody said, oh, Timothy tells tall tales, that's just what he does. And making things even worse for Timothy was the fact that he had a very clear motive for why he might harm his family. He was under crippling debt, and his relationship with his wife was incredibly toxic and often became physical, and there were lots of witnesses to that. During Timothy's trial, despite the fact that Timothy and his lawyers tried everything they could to point the finger at John Christie, saying, no, he's the guy responsible, because John was constantly on the witness stand and had this impeccable resume as this war hero and this police constable, and he was well respected and he was well spoken and he was smart, the jury completely believed him. He was the epitome of credible, whereas Timothy was the opposite. And so it was largely John, the real killer's testimony that actually put Timothy, the innocent man, on death row. Also, the police totally botched the investigation from the beginning, because the police went into the investigation already completely convinced that Timothy was guilty. This was an open and shut case, and us gathering evidence and doing all this didn't really matter because Timothy was the guy. And so because the police were so focused on Timothy, they were blind to really obvious things all around them. For example, during their several searches of the apartment complex, both inside and out, a dog ran into the backyard and actually dug up one of the skeletons from one of those two women that John had killed years earlier and buried out there. And so a human skull and a human leg bone were visible outside as police are walking around. John was able to grab the skull and chuck it next door into a burned out building, but the leg bone was literally propped up against the side of the backyard in plain view. Nobody caught it. The police are also believed to have coerced Timothy into signing his final confession, where he says, I not only killed my wife, but I also killed my daughter. There's even some speculation that the police literally signed it for him, that they forged the entire document. And so Timothy gets hauled off and executed. Meanwhile, John, the real killer, just keeps on killing. He would murder at least 4 more women, including his wife, Ethel, using the same technique, the gas machine followed by strangulation. And it was during the time that he killed these last 4 victims that we know about that John became increasingly turned on by death itself. And so that was why he stuffed his wife's body right underneath the floorboards in his kitchen, and he stuffed those other 3 women inside of that tiny little room behind that secret door in the pantry, so that all day long as he was in his apartment, it constantly smelled of decomposing flesh. After Beresford Brown opened that secret door in the kitchen pantry and discovered those 3 women's bodies smashed inside of there, he would tell the police, and then 10 days later, on March 31st, 1953, John Christie would be found and arrested. He would confess to killing all 8 victims, but the police only had enough evidence to charge him with 1 murder, and that was the murder of his wife, Ethel. But he was found guilty of that, and it was enough to warrant a death sentence. On July 15th of that year, at about 9 a.m., John Christie found himself sitting in the same condemned suite at Pentonville Prison that Timothy Evans had been sitting in 3.5 years earlier. Then, moments later, the door behind John opened up. The same execution team that killed Timothy Evans came inside, they grabbed John, they hoisted him up, they moved him over to the door that led into the execution chamber. The door flung open and John got his first look at the gallows. They rushed him over to the middle of the room, they pulled the noose down, tied it tight around his neck, they put the bag down over his head, all the guards stepped to the side, and then right as the executioner is about to pull down the lever, John, out of the blue, says, "Wait, my nose itches." To which the executioner just said, "It won't bother you for long," and then he pulled the switch. Due in large part to the massive injustice in this case, where an obviously innocent man was carted off and executed, the UK would suspend the death penalty in 1965, and then in 1969, they would abolish it entirely. Between those two dates, in 1966, Timothy would receive a posthumous pardon for the murder of his family, meaning he is officially an innocent man. In August of 2015, 16-year-old Nacy Perez suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. As she lay there scanning around the dark, tiny room that she was in, it dawned on her that the most likely reason she had just woken up is because she really needed to use the bathroom. And so she climbed out of her bed and she began carefully walking across the room where her other relatives were sleeping on the floor as she moved towards the back of the house. Nacy lived in a town called La Entrada, which is located in one of the poorest and most dangerous countries in the world, Honduras. But despite the harshness of her reality, Nacy was pretty happy. She had recently married the boy she was in love with. His name was Rudy, and the two of them were both very excited about their first child, which was due in a matter of months. So Nacy reached the back of her house, she pushed open the back door, and she stepped out into the hot night air, and then she made the familiar walk across her backyard toward the outhouse. But Nacy would never reach the outhouse. The next morning, Nacy's mother woke up first. Her name was Maria, and as she passed by the back door, she looked outside and she saw Nacy lying on the ground. And so Maria, she screams, she runs outside to her daughter and she flips her over and she's looking at her, and Nacy is unresponsive and she's foaming at the mouth. Now, they're in a part of the world where healthcare was not top-notch, not even close. And Honduras is known for being an extremely religious part of the world. And so Maria did not think, oh, I should send my daughter to the hospital or I should call a doctor. Instead, Maria and the rest of Nacy's family, who had all streamed outside because of the commotion, they decided to call a priest to perform an exorcism because the belief was Nacy must be possessed with demons. And so a priest was hailed to the residence, and the priest would perform an exorcism on Nacy, but it wouldn't do anything. And so at that point, Maria and the rest of Nacy's family would take Nacy, who was still totally unresponsive and foaming, to the local hospital. But by that point, it was too late. Nacy was dead. When Nacy's family asked the doctors what happened to her, they said they didn't know. And so, heartbroken and confused, Maria and the rest of Nacy's family brought Nacy back home. They had an ad hoc memorial service, and then they buried her. The following day, Nacy's husband, Rudy, who was totally distraught because he has not only lost his wife, he's also lost his unborn child. He got up early and he just had to go to the cemetery to be with his wife. And so he made his way over to the local cemetery and he found his wife's gravesite. Nacy had not been buried under the earth. Instead, she had been placed into a coffin, and that coffin had been slid into this big hollowed-out cement block that was as big as a coffin. And then once the coffin was slid inside, they walled up the opening. So basically, her gravesite was this kind of freestanding big cement block. And so Rudy finds Nacy's cement block, and he goes up right next to it, and he leans up against it, and he begins to quietly sob. But just seconds later, he would hear something in that cemetery that would cause him to go completely silent, stand up, and sprint away. The day before, approximately 1 or 2 hours after Nacy's coffin was slid inside of that cement tomb and walled up, Nacy woke up. she was never dead. It's unclear what originally caused Nacy to collapse outside of her house on the way to the outhouse, but the two leading theories are, one, she had a severe panic attack caused by a nearby gunshot, or two, she had a severe episode of cataplexy. Cataplexy is the sudden, uncontrollable loss of muscle function, often brought on by very strong emotions. A mild case could be just having your knees buckle for a second. A severe case, which is what they believe could have happened to Nacy, would result in basically complete paralysis. But whatever the case was, the doctors at the hospital got it wrong. When Nacy was brought to them, she was not dead. And so when she woke up inside of her coffin that was encased in cement, she began shrieking and trying to pound up against the inside of these tight walls that were pressed up against her. And at some point, she even managed to force her hands up near her head, and she shattered the glass window that sat in her coffin that looked right down at her face. She broke the glass, but it didn't help her at all because, again, it's just cement on the other side. And so glass shards fell into her mouth and into her eyes. And so she stayed like that, screaming and trying to fight her way out for over 24 hours, trying to get anybody's attention. But nobody heard her. Until her husband, Rudy, he leaned up against her tomb and he put his ear right up against the cement and began to cry. And that's when he heard, through the cement, the sound of his wife calling out for help. Rudy instantly ran and got help, and he and his family came back, and they broke open the side of this tomb, and they pulled Nacy's coffin out, and even though she was now unresponsive, she had a faint heartbeat. And so they rushed her to the hospital, but by the time she got there, she really had died. Nacy had finally just run out of oxygen, likely within minutes of her husband finally hearing her screams. In 2007, the now famous cult classic movie, Into the Wild, was released to movie theaters for the first time. The movie, which is based on a true story, centers on the life of a young man named Christopher McCandless. In 1990, Christopher graduated from a really good school with honors, and by all accounts, he could have gone on to get a really good, high-paying job, but Christopher didn't want a job. He wanted freedom. And so without telling his parents, because they would not have been happy about this idea, he gave away all of his possessions, he gave all his money to charity, and he headed off to Alaska to live off the grid by himself. He eventually would find this rusted out old city bus in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, and he would make this bus his shelter, and he would live inside of this bus for 113 days before he unfortunately died of starvation. While Christopher's story is obviously tragic, the movie about his life, Into the Wild, really focuses on Christopher's unrelenting spirit and his constant drive towards getting the thing he wants the most, which is freedom. And so at the end of this movie, the audience is left feeling not sad, but inspired. Inspired to take big risks in life and seek out adventure before it's too late. One audience member who was totally inspired by Christopher McCandless's life story was an 18-year-old young man named Matt Higgins who lived in Oregon. Matt was about to graduate high school, and unlike a lot of his peers, he had no idea what he should do after graduation, whether it was get a job or go to school. But after watching Into the Wild, a third option appeared to him, which was to head off into the wild, just like Christopher McCandless had done, except not permanently. Matt quickly fell in love with this option. He viewed it as a chance to kind of take a break from reality and go find himself, and then at the end of his stint in the wild, he could come back and, get a job or go to school. And so Matt's official Into the Wild plan was that he would graduate in 2007, and then in the spring of 2008, he would hike the entirety of the California section of the infamously rugged and beautiful Pacific Crest Trail. And he would do this all on his own. This section of the Pacific Crest Trail that he planned on hiking was roughly 1,700 miles long. It began on the border of Mexico in Southern California, and it wound its way north up to the border of Oregon. The trail cut through deserts and up and over mountains, and there was lots of dangerous wildlife to contend with. And on top of that, there were many points along this trail where hikers were very isolated. They were not anywhere near civilization, and so if anything were to happen to them, they'd be on their own. And so naturally, this hike was not a beginner hike. However, Matt was not a beginner hiker. He had grown up hiking and camping all over Oregon and the western United States. He had spent time in totally well-marked and safe areas, and he had also spent time hiking around very dangerous and isolated areas where there were cougars and bears and unmarked cliffs everywhere. And so Matt felt like, with his experience in the outdoors, he was perfectly suited to take on this big of an adventure. And in many ways, that was true. However, something was going to happen to him while he was out on the Pacific Crest Trail that no amount of hiking or camping experience could have prepared him for. So Matt graduated from high school in 2007, and in keeping with his plan, in the spring of 2008, he packed up his stuff, he headed to the airport, and he flew south to Southern California. And when he got there, he made his way all the way south to the border of Mexico, and there he picked up the start of the Pacific Crest Trail, and he began heading north. For the first few weeks of his hike, Matt would spend the entire day hiking as far as his body would allow him, and then at night, when it got too dark or when he got too tired, he would just set up his campsite right off the edge of the trail, and then after a quick bite to eat, he'd climb inside of his tent and he'd go to sleep. And then the next day, he'd get up early and he'd do it all over again. During those first few weeks, the only real adversity that Matt ever faced, beyond just kind of normal fatigue from long distance hiking, was at one point he got a little dehydrated, and another time he almost stepped on a rattlesnake. So besides those two things, really the hike had actually been fairly routine by Matt's standards. But when he reached the Lassen National Forest, which is a very dense forest in Northern California, located about 150 miles from the end of his hike, so the border of Oregon, when he got there, this hike of his would become anything but routine. Not long after stepping foot in Lassen Forest, Matt found himself walking along this winding dirt path where the trees on both sides of this path were pressed tightly up against the edges of this trail, and because of how densely packed the trees were together, it was almost like he had these walls on either side of him that extended 100 feet into the air. And so it was very quiet and it was very dark as he was walking along, but Matt was enjoying it. All he could hear was the chirping of birds and the insects buzzing around him. It was peaceful. And so Matt's just kind of meandering his way through the forest. He's in no rush. And at some point, the trail he was on banked hard to the right. And so he makes this turn, and as he does, he looks up, and what he sees kind of startles him. About 20 feet away from him, off to the right side of the trail, is this big boulder, and sitting on this boulder are two middle-aged people, a man and a woman. They were both dressed head to toe in white. They both looked very dirty and disheveled. The man had this big, unkempt beard, and both of them were just staring daggers at Matt. And so Matt felt awkward, and he immediately looked down as he continued walking towards them. But as he got within a few feet, he looked up and kind of awkwardly smiled at them and waved and said hi, and they didn't respond. They just continued to stare at him with no discernible expression on their face, and they watched him as he walked right past them. And so after Matt walked past these two people in white, he felt really uncomfortable because he knew they were still definitely staring at him as he walked away, and he didn't want to turn around and meet their eye contact. And so he's just kind of walking away, feeling that uncomfortable feeling of someone staring at him, and he's thinking to himself, why didn't they at least wave or acknowledge him in some way? Especially considering the fact that on the Pacific Crest Trail, people go days without seeing other people. Matt, in fact, had not seen another person in days until he saw these two. And so he's thinking, how rude is that to just completely not react when another person walks past you on this trail? But Matt told himself, you know what, I don't know these people. I don't know what their issues are. For all I know, they're foreign and they didn't understand what I said. And so maybe that's why they didn't say hello back. Who knows? But you know what? It's none of my business. And so Matt just continued walking along. He never turned around to look back at these two people in white. He just carried on. A few hours later, when the sun was starting to set, Matt was still walking along this winding trail with these huge trees on either side of him, and so visibility was getting pretty poor, and so he began looking for a place to make his camp. But because of how close these trees were to the edge of this trail, and considering how dense these trees were, there was no spot for him to make his campsite without completely blocking the trail. and Matt did not want to block the trail for other people. And so what he did is he left the trail and he walked 300 feet or so into these thick trees where he found this little clearing, and that's where he set up his tent. Once it was all set up, he made some food for himself on his little stove, and then after he was done eating, he packaged up all of his leftover food inside of a waterproof bag. Then he sealed that up, and then he tied some cord to the bag and threw the bag up and over a branch of a nearby tree and kind of tied it off so the bag was sitting well off the ground. This was to make sure no bears could get to his food. And so after his leftovers were secured high up in a tree, it was totally pitch black outside. And so Matt just climbed into his tent, he zipped it up, climbed into his sleeping bag, and he fell asleep. The next morning, Matt got up right as the sun was starting to rise. And so it was still pretty dark outside, but there was a little bit of light. And so Matt unzipped his tent and he looked outside, and the first thing he noticed was his bag of food that he had put up in the tree was gone. And so Matt stepped out of his tent and he looked around thinking, maybe it fell to the ground or something, but it wasn't there. It was just gone. And so Matt thought to himself, I didn't hear anything last night, but I guess a bear must have come into the campsite, found the food, and run off with it. And so Matt began walking over to the tree where he had strung the food up to begin looking on the ground for bear prints to confirm his theory that that was who took his food. And so he walks over, he's looking around, he doesn't see any bear prints, but he does see 2 sets of human boot prints, neither of which were his. And before he could even process that, he realized these prints, these human prints, were not just underneath this tree where the food was. These prints, as he looked around him, extended all the way up to his tent and all around his tent and all over his campsite. And so as Matt is looking at this crazy trail of human prints all over the place, he's thinking to himself, how is this possible? I went to bed last night when it was already pitch black outside, and I got up basically right at sunrise, so it was still dark outside. So these 2 people that were walking all over my campsite and cutting my food down, they somehow navigated here 300 feet off the main trail in the middle of nowhere. They navigated here in total pitch blackness, and they did it silently without waking me up. How is that even possible? And so after running through this thought process, Matt realized the only logical conclusion was that the 2 people he saw on the rock, the people in white, had followed him after seeing him. They saw where he left the trail, and they had waited until he fell asleep and then snuck out and robbed him. As Matt's thinking about this, he suddenly realized that maybe they're still around. Maybe he's still being watched. And so he began whipping his head around, looking in all directions, almost expecting to see the man and the woman in white kind of poking out from behind a tree. But when he looked around, he couldn't see anyone. However, he started to get that sense that he was being watched. And so feeling really uncomfortable, he quickly packed up his campsite and walked as quickly and calmly as he could toward the trail. And as he walked, he kept thinking to himself that these people are going to jump out from behind a tree, or they're going to grab me from behind. And so he's walking faster and faster and faster. And he finally gets to the trail, and he looks down the trail and up the trail. He kind of looks all around. He doesn't see anybody. And so he tells himself, okay, they're gone. So he took a deep breath, he composed himself, and he started walking north again along the trail. Matt walked for several hours, periodically looking over his shoulder, again expecting to see the man and woman in white, but he never did. And eventually, this narrow path kind of cutting through the dense forest opened up to this big, beautiful field. And by that point, the sun was high in the sky. And so Matt's walking in this very beautiful open area. He can see in all directions. There's sunlight beaming down on him. And so even though he was totally rattled by what had happened the night before, he found himself kind of becoming more at ease about the situation. He was far less paranoid, and he began telling himself, as creepy as it is that those people in white almost certainly followed him and snuck up on his campsite in the middle of the night, as bad as that is, he thought, what? They probably were just super hungry, and they clearly needed the food more than he did. And so, what? Those people, they can have my food. Whatever. And so Matt just continued on telling himself he would never have to deal with the people in white ever again. However, he would be wrong. Over the next 3 days, Matt continued making his way north through the Lassen forest, and the trail he was on would weave between those big, beautiful open areas back inside those very densely forested areas where the trees were practically right on top of you. And during those 3 days, Matt did not see the people in white. He did not have any nighttime encounters with anybody. Nothing got stolen. And so that only reinforced the idea that, he had been a target of opportunity. They had taken what they wanted from him, and they were no longer following him. But on the 4th day after the food stealing incident, things would get spooky for Matt again. On that 4th night, Matt was once again forced to leave the trail he was on. He was in one of those very densely forested areas and walk well off the trail to find a clearing for his tent. And so he walked, several hundred feet away. He finds this clearing. He sets up his tent. And then also he sets up a perimeter of sticks all around the outside of his campsite. This was a precaution he had begun taking after the food stealing incident. These sticks were an early warning system where if any animal or person came too close to his campsite, they would step, in theory, on these sticks and they would break and they would alert Matt in the middle of the night. And so after his campsite was all set up and all prepared, Matt sat down and had a quick bite to eat, and then after storing his food, he climbed inside of his tent and he fell asleep. A few hours later, Matt suddenly woke up. Now, when he woke up, he opened his eyes, but it's pitch black in his tent, there are no windows in his tent, and it's pitch black outside. So even with his eyes open, he can't see anything. And so he's just laying there with his eyes open, but it's total darkness, and he's just listening intently, because he doesn't really know why he woke up, if something startled him, or if there's no reason at all. And so he's just laying there and he's listening, and as he's listening, he hears the distinct sound of something stepping on one of the sticks in his perimeter. And so he hears the stick break and his heart just starts racing, because he knows that an animal or a person is just a few feet away from him. And so instinctively, he kind of begins to pull his arm as quietly as he can out of his sleeping bag, and he reaches over and he grabs his hunting knife. And as he grabs the handle of the knife and he brings it closer to him, he hears the sound of more footsteps. Whatever has stepped on the stick has not slowed down at all. They don't care about the sound they just made. They're still moving towards his tent. And so Matt's starting to get really freaked out because he knows that, it could be an animal, but just a couple of days ago, 2 people were in his campsite stealing his food and walking all around his tent. And so that's what's going through his head. And so Matt's laying there preparing himself to potentially have to slash out if anybody came close to his tent. I mean, he's in the middle of nowhere. If a person is out here, it's not his friend. And so he's laying there, he's kind of shaking and he's listening really intently. And the footsteps are just getting closer and closer and closer to his tent until they stop right next to his head. They are literally about a foot away from him. And so he can't see anything. He's just listening really intently. And then he starts to hear whispering. But the whispering is not coming from this person right here. The whispering is coming from everywhere in the forest. It's coming from all different directions. And so Matt doesn't know what to think about this. And as he's hearing this whispering, which is getting more and more frantic, whoever is standing right outside of his tent begins circling his tent. So now he hears footsteps just walking in a circle around his tent while frantic whispers are coming in from all directions. And so at this point, Matt is so terrified, he's just frozen. He knows that he's holding that knife, but he won't be able to do anything with it. He's just petrified. And then as soon as this total nightmare had begun, it just stopped. The whispering, silence. The footsteps stopped. And so in a way, it was kind of relieving, but in another way, Matt's laying there thinking, I want to hear the sound of footsteps retreating into the forest, leaving, but I haven't heard that. It went from footsteps all around the tent and whispering everywhere to silence, as if whoever is out there is still out there. And they're just standing there waiting for him. And because it's so dark, he can't even look. He can't look outside and see. And so he's left just laying in his tent, wondering if 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people are just waiting outside of his tent. He's got no idea. And so finally the sun would come up in the morning. And again, Matt has not heard the sound of retreating footsteps. And so maybe they're still just standing outside. But once the sun had totally come up and there was some light outside that he could see through his tent, Matt decided he just had to check. And so he reached over and he quickly unzipped the flap of the tent and he looked outside. He didn't see anyone. He leapt outside with his knife, ready to confront anyone who was out there, but there was no one. And so Matt, he's not thinking, oh, great, they're gone. He's thinking, are they just like a few feet away, hiding behind trees? And so for a few minutes, Matt just began looking all around his campsite, kind of expecting to see, those people in white or other people he doesn't know, but he doesn't see anyone. And then Matt starts thinking to himself, was this just a nightmare? Did that not even happen? Am I imagining this? But when he looked down, he saw clear boot prints all over his campsite, including a nice track all the way around his tent. And so this nightmare really had played out in real life. And so he quickly gets everything back into his pack, he throws it on his shoulder, and he just starts running back towards the trail. And when he got to the trail, he continued running north. And as he's running along and looking over his shoulder the whole time, he's telling himself, I just need to get out of Lassen National Forest. I need to get out of the people in white's turf, get away from this place, and I'll be left alone. And so that motivated him to spend the whole day moving as fast as he possibly could. And by that afternoon, he had finally escaped Lassen National Forest. He was out and he was in one of these smaller towns that kind of butted up alongside this forest. And so that night, he camped out right near this town. He wanted to be as close to civilization as possible to ensure his safety. And so as he's laying in his tent that night, he began thinking about what had happened over the past couple of days. At this point, he was nearly certain that the people in white that he had seen on that boulder, they had to be behind these nighttime encounters. They just had to be. And so he's thinking to himself, okay, well, the first encounter I had with them, when they stole his food, yeah, that's creepy, but it makes sense. They followed him, they went to his campsite, they stole his food. Okay, fine. That makes sense to him. But the second encounter, the one that had happened the night before, that didn't make any sense. Assuming it was, again, the people in white responsible, that meant they had been following Matt the whole time, and he had not seen them somehow, even though over the last couple of days, he had been looking over his shoulder constantly, looking for those people, but he didn't see them, and they still managed to follow him all the way over several days to this other unmarked campsite, hundreds of feet off the main trail. So how did they do that? And then two, once they were at his campsite and he's laying there listening to them, walking around the campsite, whispering to each other, what were they doing? And then how did the footsteps and whispering just stop immediately and he didn't even hear the sound of them retreating into the woods? How did they do that? And so Matt would go over this and over this until finally he would fall asleep. And then the next morning when he got up, it was the first thing he was thinking about, the people in white. What were they doing and why and where were they? And so as Matt packed up his campsite that morning, it did cross his mind, that maybe he should just stop the hike right now and call his family, have them come pick him up and get out of here. But this hike, this huge hike he had planned, was really important to him, and he was only about 100 miles away from the finish line, which meant he had already hiked over 1,600 miles, and he just didn't want to quit. He wanted to finish what he started. And so he packed up his stuff, he threw it over his shoulder, and he continued on. And so that day, Matt would leave that little town, and he would make his way up into another very dense forest called the Mount Shasta Forest. Mount Shasta was a lot like the Lassen Forest, except Mount Shasta has a very disturbing backstory. Specifically, lots and lots of people go missing inside of Mount Shasta, and often they go missing under baffling circumstances. The most frightening of these missing persons reports are when someone comes back, the survivor of the event, and they will say, they saw their hiking companion. They clearly saw them. And then they turned their back on them just for a few moments, few minutes, whatever it was. And when they turned back around, the person they were with was now gone. No trace of them, nothing. They're just gone. And despite a massive search for them, they're never found again. There is a distressing number of missing people in Mount Shasta that sound just like that. It's totally terrifying. So with that in mind, Matt makes his way into the Mount Shasta forest, and even though it totally stressed him out to once again be walking on these dirt pathways where the trees are very tight on either side of you, they're very dense, and as he's walking, he's kind of looking in both directions, expecting to see somebody watching him. Despite feeling that way, Matt just continued to stay focused and kept telling himself to just continue on, because you're so close to the end. And so the first 3 days that he was in the Mount Shasta forest, Matt would just keep his head down and very stoically every day he would just hike as far as he possibly could. In the evening, he would set up his campsite either right off the trail or maybe a little ways off the trail in a clearing. And he didn't have any run-ins with the people in white or anybody else for that matter. He was totally left alone. But on his 4th day in the Mount Shasta forest, all that would change. On that 4th day, Matt found himself not inside one of those very dense forested areas, but rather in this very open trail that was up on the side of this mountain. And because this trail was fairly high up in elevation, the tree coverage was fairly sparse. And so there was great visibility. He could see miles ahead of him, and when he turned around, he could see miles behind him. And so Matt is just walking along this trail, kind of enjoying the day. It's beautiful outside. And at some point, he turns around and looks behind him. Now, all day he'd been doing that, and he had not seen anyone. But this time, when he turned around, he saw 2 little white dots, miles and miles back, slowly making their way along the trail that he was on. It was the people in white. They were back. At this point, Matt was at least 50 miles or more away from that first place he had walked past the people in white when they were sitting on that boulder, which meant, 1, Matt was right. These people in white really had followed him and almost certainly were responsible for the nighttime visits he was getting. And 2, for reasons unknown, they were still following him. Matt suddenly didn't care at all about completing his big hike. He just wanted to get the heck away from those people. And so very quickly he pulled out his map and he looked, and to his horror, he realized he was in one of the most isolated portions of the entire hike. He was at least 25 miles away from the nearest civilization, a little town called Castella, California. And so without a better option, Matt put the map back in his pocket. He took one last look at the people in white who were making steady gains on him, and then Matt just turned away from them and began booking it down the trail. And Matt would run for hours and hours and hours without stopping. Even when he turned around and could no longer see the people in white, he just kept on running. And then when the sun set and he could barely see the trail, he just kept on running. It literally wasn't until it was so dark outside that he actually couldn't see the ground anymore that Matt finally, totally exhausted, came to a stop. And then from there, he turned and left the trail and walked way away from the trail, hundreds of feet deep into the forest to get as far away from these people in white as he possibly could. And so finally, he found this clearing very far away from the trail. He set up his tent right in the middle of it, and then he very diligently laid out his perimeter of sticks around his campsite, making sure there were no gaps. And then he climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up, and then keeping on all of his stuff in case he needed to make a run for it, he got inside of his sleeping bag, and he just laid there with no expectation that he was going to sleep. He was terrified. As he laid there, he thought to himself, okay, I have now run at least several miles ahead of them. I know that was them. I know I got some distance on them. There's no way they saw where I turned off the trail and where I've set up this campsite, so they can't possibly find me. And so Matt would lay in the tent for several hours just waiting to fall asleep. And then finally he would start to get tired because at this point it's totally quiet outside. He hasn't heard anything. And so he begins to doze off to sleep. And as he's getting more and more tired, he hears the sound of someone stepping on his perimeter of sticks. And as soon as he hears that stick break, he hears the all too familiar whispering pick up all around the forest. And then something new happens. Before Matt can even do anything, his tent lights up like a Christmas tree. Someone is shining a light on his tent. Someone has snuck up on his campsite in the middle of nowhere, hundreds and hundreds of feet off the trail, in the middle of the night. They've found him, and they're shining a light on him. And then the light clicks off, and it's silent. And at this point, Matt's fight or flight instinct kicks in, and he rips off his sleeping bag, he jumps outside, and begins screaming nonsense and flailing around with a knife, trying to intimidate these people to get away from him. And then after he stops for a second, he hears a stick crunch right behind him. And he whips his head around to look at who is standing right behind him. And as he's turning out of his peripheral vision, he sees a dark figure running towards him. He doesn't think twice. He just turns and begins running away from the campsite. Now remember, it's pitch black in the forest. There's trees everywhere. And so Matt's smashing into tree. Branches are hitting him. He's falling to the ground, but he is on a pure adrenaline high, and he is just sprinting as fast as he possibly can away from this person who is likely still chasing him. And after 5 minutes of running, he stumbles and falls forward and kind of lands at the base of this fallen tree. The tree had landed in such a way that it was kind of propped on a rock. So there was a small gap underneath the tree. And so Matt, thinking quickly, kind of slid himself underneath this log and positioned himself so he was looking back in the direction he was running from. And as he laid there, he saw in the distance this light bobbing around. These people are looking for him. They're searching the forest for him. And so he watched in horror, tucked underneath this log, as whoever had the light and whoever else was with them, they moved closer and closer and closer, but they did not find him tucked underneath the log. They just walked right on past him. And so Matt would remain underneath this log all night until finally the sun came up. And at that point, even though it was fairly obvious that whoever was looking for him, they were now gone, Matt was still terrified. And so he stayed under the log for several hours until it was about early afternoon. And then he finally pulled himself out from under the log and he looked around. He couldn't see anyone. And then instead of going back to his campsite and getting his gear, he just totally abandoned it. He was worried that these people in white or whoever it was, that they were still going to be there. And so he just turned and continued running away from his campsite back out to the trail. And once he got the trail, he continued running on the trail all the way to Costella, California. And when he got there, he hitchhiked his way to the town of Mount Shasta. And there he would speak to police as well as the Forestry Service about what he had experienced. And so they would take all of his information down and they would put him up in a motel for the night. And then the next day, Matt would get in touch with his family and they would drive from Oregon to Mount Shasta. They would pick him up and they would take him back home. Months later, Matt would contact the Mount Shasta police and the Forest Service and would just follow up and say, hey, have you learned anything else about these people in white? Have you caught them? Has anybody else come forward? And the police would say, they did have a number of people coming forward saying that things had been stolen from their campsites. These are people that were in Mount Shasta, in Lassen Forest, and the surrounding forests. But Matt was the only one who had reported being terrorized by this mysterious couple in white. And so to this day, Matt has no idea who those two people were, what they wanted with him, beyond obviously the food they took. I mean, they continued to stalk him for nearly 100 miles. And he has no idea how they were able to keep finding his campsites that were hundreds of feet off the main trail in unmarked areas that they would somehow navigate to in total darkness without alerting Matt. It's all a big mystery. Of the United States is a quiet little town called Millstadt, Illinois. Millstadt is home to about 4,000 people, and had it not been for Ashley Reeves, only those 4,000 people and their friends and family would even know that Millstadt existed. In 2006, Ashley Reeves was a 17-year-old high school student who lived with her parents and her younger sister Casey in Millstadt. Ashley was an excellent student who, even though she was over a year from her high school graduation, she was already thinking about what college colleges she wanted to go to. She was also extremely likable and outgoing, and she had this huge, infectious smile, and so she had tons of friends, and she had a very serious boyfriend who her parents adored. His name was Jeremy, and he was a high school student as well. On the morning of Thursday, April 27th of that year, Ashley got up, and like every other morning, she got ready for school alongside her sister Casey, and then right before Ashley stepped out to head off to school, she told her parents that after school, she had a job interview on the other side of town, and then after her interview, her plan was to play basketball with some friends, and then she'd be home. And so her parents said, okay, well, hey, good luck with your job interview, and just make sure you're home before 10:30 p.m. And so Ashley said, no problem, I'll see you tonight, and then she left. That afternoon, after school, Ashley made her way to Jeremy's locker, and when she got to him, Jeremy handed her his keys to his car. He had an SUV, and he was lending it to her for the day so she could go to the interview and then go play basketball. And so Ashley took the keys, she thanked him, she gave him a hug, and then she turned and she walked down the hallway where she met up with her sister Casey at her locker, and then the two girls left the school, they went out to the student parking lot, they found Jeremy's SUV, they hopped inside, and then Ashley began driving them back to their house. When they got there, Casey hopped out of the car, she said bye to Ashley, and then Ashley left their house and she began driving to Fairview Heights, which was a town about 15 miles away where her interview was going to be. Several hours later, around 10 p.m., Ashley's parents had not heard from their daughter, and it was getting close to her curfew, and so they asked Casey if she had spoken with Ashley, and, did she know how her interview went? Did she know when she was going to be home? But Casey would tell them, actually, no, I haven't talked to Ashley since she dropped me off from school. And so Ashley's parents said, okay, no big deal. And they called Ashley, but Ashley didn't pick up. So they sent her a series of text messages. But after a couple of minutes of not getting any response, they decided to just call her boyfriend, Jeremy, to see if maybe he knew what was going on with Ashley. But when they spoke to Jeremy, he would say that, I haven't spoken with Ashley since I gave her the keys to my SUV. And I've actually been trying to talk to her all day. I've been calling her and texting her, but I still haven't heard back. And so at this point, Ashley's parents were starting to get really worried. And so after hanging up with Jeremy, they began calling other friends of Ashley's to see if maybe they had spoken to her and knew what was going on. But all of her friends that they spoke to all had the same story. We haven't talked to her since the end of school, and she's not returning our calls or texts. And so Ashley's mother, she just sensed that something was terribly wrong. And so without any hesitation, she just called the police. Now, the police in this town were used to getting calls every now and again from parents whose teenage child had run off and they were concerned about them. But virtually every time the police investigated, they would find the teenager had just kind of been blowing off their friends and family, and they would pop up maybe a couple hours later, totally unharmed. But the Millstadt police would later remark when they heard Ashley's mother's voice over the phone, the fear in her voice was so pronounced, it immediately pushed the police department to take this case very seriously. And so that night, right after this phone call, the Millstadt Police Department went out in force to try to locate Jeremy's SUV, the car that Ashley had been driving around that day. And the first place they went to look for this car was Latterman Park, which is this very popular public park that has a really popular basketball court that lots of teenagers would go to all the time, and Ashley was known to frequent that park. And this park was located about halfway between Fairview Heights, where her interview was, and Millstadt, where she lived. And so they go to Latterman Park, and right away, sitting in the parking lot, they find Jeremy's SUV. But Ashley is not in the car, she's nowhere near the car, and when they searched the car, there was nothing of significance inside of it. There was just some of Ashley's clothes lying around. The police would spend all night and well into the morning combing Latterman Park looking for any sign of Ashley, but there wasn't one. And so as the sun came up and the police were nowhere closer to finding this girl, they began to suspect that, perhaps foul play was involved. And so the first person they hauled in for questioning was Ashley's boyfriend, Jeremy. But as soon as he sat in the interrogation room, he demonstrated a real concern for Ashley. He had a rock-solid alibi, and he basically was an open book. And so they quickly ruled him out as a suspect. And then the police basically began hauling in all of Ashley's friends, acquaintances, and family members, basically anybody that knew her. They were bringing them into the station to find out if they knew anything that could help them figure out where Ashley was. And more specifically, the police were really looking to see if any of these people were hiding something. And sure enough, a few of the friends that were brought in were. According to a few of Ashley's closest friends, Ashley was in not one, but two romantic relationships. One was the public relationship she had with Jeremy, and the other was a secret relationship that was actually illegal. In order to hide this forbidden second relationship, Ashley would tell her family and her friends that she was going to the park to play basketball, when in reality, she was going to the park to meet up with this secret second partner. And the day before, when Ashley went missing, her friends told police that that was the exact reason she was going to Latterman Park. The police got the name of this secret person from Ashley's friends. His name was Sam Shelton, and the police tracked him down. When they found him, he was at a baseball practice, but the police didn't care. They marched right on to the baseball diamond, and they grabbed Sam, and they brought him back to the police station. And then when he got there, they sat him down in the interrogation room, and he's still wearing his baseball uniform, and they ask him about his relationship with Ashley. And he immediately denies it and says he does not have a relationship with Ashley. He's got no idea why he's here. But pretty quickly, after a few questions, Sam's answers became inconsistent, and so the police just ratcheted up the pressure on him. And then finally, after 12 hours of questioning, the interrogator brings up Sam's mother and his grandmother, and he says to Sam, how would they feel if they knew you were lying to the police right now? And this just broke Sam, and so he cracked. Now, at this point, the police were already expecting the worst when it came to Ashley, but they were not ready for just how brutal Sam's confession would be about what exactly he did to her. The following is an account based on his confession. 30 hours earlier, Ashley wrapped up her interview in Fairview Heights, and she made her way to Latterman Park to meet up with Sam. And now it's not clear exactly how they met up, but eventually the two of them did connect, and they made their way over to Sam's car, where they became intimate. Afterwards, the two are sitting in the front two seats of Sam's car. Sam is in the driver's seat and Ashley is in the passenger seat. And while they're sitting there, something happens that causes this huge fight between the two of them. And at some point, Sam tells Ashley to get out of the car. But Ashley refuses. She wants to talk to him. She wants to deal with their issues, but Sam's not having it. And so he gets so mad at her that he lunges across the center console of the car and he puts Ashley into a vicious chokehold. Now, he tells police his plan was to kind of yank her out of the car, but he squeezed so hard around her neck that he heard this loud popping sound coming from her neck. It was the sound of her neck breaking. And so as soon as he heard it, Sam let go, and Ashley kind of crumpled forward and hit the front dashboard of the car. And so Sam is staring at her, wondering what he should do. He's kind of looking around, making sure no one saw what he just did. And then he reached over and lifted her back up to see if she was still alive, and he saw she was. But instead of trying to get her help, he decides right then and there he's going to kill her. And so he reaches over and he begins choking her. But after several minutes of throttling her, she just wouldn't die. And so Sam pulled his belt off of his waist and he wrapped it around Ashley's neck. And then he began pulling. But he would tell police he couldn't stand looking at Ashley's face while he did this. He said she was staring right at him, her tongue was coming out of her mouth, she was frothing, and her face was turning this ghastly shade of gray-blue. And so at some point, when she still hadn't died, he released the belt from around her neck, and he turned her body so she was facing the window away from him, and then he repositioned the belt on her neck, and then he put his foot on her back to use as leverage, and then he pulled as hard as he possibly could on her throat for quite a while until the belt actually broke around her neck. And then at that point, he checked to make sure she was dead, and when she was, he stuffed her down into the floorboards in front of the passenger seat, and then he drove several miles across town to another park called Citizens Park that was very heavily forested. And once he parked in the parking lot, he looked around to make sure no one was watching, and then he dragged Ashley's body out of the car and deep into the woods where he abandoned her. It would turn out Ashley was far from the only teenage girl who found Sam Shelton attractive. Many teenage girls in the area thought he was the perfect catch. He was smart, he was handsome, and he had these beautiful, striking blue eyes that you couldn't help but just stare at. However, there was something unique about Sam that made him fundamentally different than all the other guys at their schools. Sam was not a student. He was a 27-year-old middle school teacher in Millstadt, and he also was the high school baseball coach. He had never been Ashley's teacher directly. However, years earlier when she was in middle school, he had begun grooming her for exploitation. And so fast forward to 2006, when she was 17, he had effectively manipulated her into believing she was in this romantic relationship with him, when in reality, he was just using his position of power to abuse her. In addition to being a school teacher, Sam was also an aspiring pro wrestler. He would often compete in local showcases under the nickname The Teacher. While Sam was probably nowhere near good enough to actually become a professional wrestler like you would see on TV, he was extremely strong and really knew how to do a chokehold. And so when he attacked Ashley and put her in that vicious chokehold, she had no chance at escaping. She was completely doomed. Shortly after his confession, Sam would tell the police that he would take them out into the forest of Citizens Park to try to find Ashley's body. But when they got there, it was late, it had been raining for several hours, and Sam right away acted like he couldn't figure out exactly where he had left her. And so the police were actually starting to think, is he lying to us? Is this whole thing just kind of made up? Did he really attack her? Is she really out here? But after about 30 minutes of the police and Sam kind of trudging around the thick forest, one of the officers suddenly sees something on the ground. He raises his flashlight, and there in a clearing is Ashley's body. And so the police and Sam, they walk over to her, and they're standing above her ruined body. Her neck is totally bent at a grotesque angle. She's covered in bugs. But as they're standing there and they're watching her, her chest suddenly starts to move. She wasn't dead. She had been left for dead, and she had been out in the woods with a broken neck for 30 hours in the freezing cold and the rain. She only had a t-shirt and some pants on, but she was alive. And so moments later, the paramedics, they come rushing into the forest. They pick her up really gently. They bring her out and they rush her to the hospital, where she'd be put into a medically induced coma. The doctors would tell her family that unfortunately her injuries were just too serious and we don't expect her to ever wake up again. But miraculously, she would. Now, she would have to relearn how to walk and talk and eat and drink, but she would do all of those things. And today, she is 32 years old. She is happily married. She has 2 kids of her own. And by and large, she leads a very happy, normal life. As for Sam Shelton, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for attempted murder, and he's still in prison today. However, he is up for parole in 2024. In 2012, a 22-year-old woman named Simone was living in a small winemaking village called Rüdesheim am Rhein, which is located in southwestern Germany. This village is strikingly beautiful. It's full of quaint European homes, and there's lots of rolling green hills with vineyards as far as the eye can see, and the village sits right on the banks of the Rhine River. Simone had grown up in this picturesque village, and she had loved it, but this was going to be her last summer before she left and headed off to New York City to start the next chapter of her life. And while she was excited about that, she was also kind of sad, because this village and everybody inside of it were the only things she had ever known. And so the idea of leaving them behind just seemed very strange to her. But instead of focusing on the kind of growing anxiety around her imminent departure from Germany, she focused on what she would be doing that summer while she was still in Germany. Some of Simone's fondest memories of her childhood were of her time spent at summer camp. And this summer camp was located in this forest that was not far from her village. And every summer in July, Simone, along with about 200 other kids from her village and from neighboring villages, would converge on the campgrounds in the forest for 2 weeks of playing games and going on scavenger hunts and putting on stage plays and just generally having a really good time. But when Simone became a teenager and was too old to be a camp attendee, she decided she would volunteer and be a camp counselor. And she found it was awesome. She immediately connected with the other camp counselors, and she felt all grown up, having a real job, and she loved goofing around with all of the kids. And so every summer since that first time volunteering, Simone had gone back and volunteered again. And this summer was no different. So, in mid-July of that year, Simone packed up her things and she headed off to the forest. The way this camp worked was the 200 plus kids that were attending the camp, they would get dropped off in the mornings each day by their parents, and they'd play and run around all day. And then in the late afternoon, their parents would come back and pick them up. So none of the kids were sleeping over at the camp during these 2 weeks. However, the 30 plus counselors, they would just stay at the camp for the full 2 weeks. They would just sleep in tents out in the forest. Technically, the reason they did this was to make sure they had enough time in the morning to prep the campgrounds for the kids, and then also in the evenings to have enough time to clean up and kind of have it ready for the next day. But in reality, Simone and the other counselors all knew that the camping out in the forest was the best part of the volunteer experience. After all the kids went home for the night, all of the counselors would finish up all of their duties and then rush off into the forest where their tents were and where there was a fire pit, and they would have some beers and wine because the legal drinking age in Germany is actually 16. So all these counselors are having a couple of drinks, and then before long they'd be laughing and telling stories and just generally having a great time. So that July in 2012, Simone and the other counselors arrived at the campgrounds a day early, and they caught up with each other and they prepared the campground. And then the next morning, all the kids showed up and everything went off without a hitch. And then that afternoon, after all the kids had been picked up by their parents, Simone and the other counselors rushed to finish up all their duties and then headed off into the woods to enjoy their first night hanging out together. After a couple of beers had been passed around the campfire, everybody was in good spirits and laughing and telling stories. But pretty quickly, people started to fade and get tired because, it was their first day back at camp and it had been a long, tiring day. And so people very gradually began retiring to their tents to go to bed. And eventually Simone, too, had crawled into her tent and gotten onto her cot to try to sleep herself. But she found that night it was so hot she couldn't be in her tent. It was stifling inside of there. And so she decides she's just going to sleep out in the open where it's a little bit cooler. And so she picks up her fold-up cot and she brings it out into the open, and she sees there are several other counselors who have done the same thing. And so she puts her cot down next to one of her good friends who's already asleep in her cot. And then Simone climbs into her cot, she gets under her covers, and she tries to fall asleep. But for the next hour, Simone just tosses and turns, she can't get comfortable, and by that time, everybody else has completely passed out. So it's just her, she's counting down the time until she has to get up again to start the next day, and so she's getting stressed about that. But eventually, she would fall asleep. However, she would immediately be thrust into one of the most visceral and intense nightmares she had ever had in her entire life. In her dream, she opens her eyes and she looks out in front of her, and it's this desert city, and there are hundreds of people all in front of her, just standing there looking up at her. And then she notices on her left and on her right are these two men, these big, huge men that are both working on something behind her. She doesn't really know what it is, but they're obviously busy doing something. And she kind of glances up at one of them and she notices he's holding something that looks like a wreath, like a holiday wreath you would hang on your door. And so Simone looks away from the guy with the wreath and just looks back out at this huge sea of people, which is totally bizarre because no one's moving, no one's making any sound, they're just staring at her. And then she feels this shooting pain in the top of her head. The man who was standing on her right was not holding a holiday wreath. He was holding a crown of thorns, and now he, along with the guy on the other side of her, were working together to press this crown of thorns into her head. And so Simone is feeling the thorns being pressed deeper and deeper into her scalp, and she tries to fight them off, but she realizes she can't move. She can't even turn her head to look at them. She can only see them out of her periphery vision. And then she tries to scream out for help to someone in the crowd to come help her, but when she opens her mouth, no sound comes out. And so as she's sitting there, all she can do is stare straight out ahead of her as the pressure of these thorns are driven deeper and deeper into her skin. And then at some point, blood begins dripping down in front of her eyes. And around that point, the pain became so blinding, so awful, that it woke her up. And as soon as she woke up, she shot up and she reached for her head to make sure there was no crown of thorns on her. And as she's doing that, she's thinking, okay, phew, it was just a dream. That was just a horrible dream. I'm in this forest. I'm good. I'm safe. And as she's kind of patting on her head, she's realizing her head is wet. And as she's touching her head, she's realizing it hurts. There's a stinging pain in her head. And then she realizes it's not just a stinging pain, it's a throbbing, intense pain all over her head. And so as she's kind of having this realization that her dream is now kind of segued into her real life, she looks out ahead of her and she sees off in the distance in the tree line, something is running through the woods. She can't tell who or what it is, but she makes a mental note that there is someone running away from them. But this pain in her head has gotten so intense that she can't focus on anything else. She can only focus on the pain. And as she's thinking about how much her head hurts, she screams in pain. And the girl who was laying next to her that had been asleep, she wakes up to the sound of the scream, but it's totally pitch black. She has no idea what's going on with Simone. And so this girl, she sits up and she's trying to get Simone to tell her what's going on, but Simone has no idea. She's totally frantic. She can't really make sense of what's happening. And so this friend, she reaches down and she picks up a flashlight, she turns it on, and she aims the light at Simone, illuminating her head. And when this friend sees Simone's head, she starts to scream. Seconds later, the rest of the counselors that had been sleeping out were awake, and they were rushing Simone, who was now shaking and vomiting, over to one of the staff vans. And then 15 minutes later, they had driven her to the emergency room. It would turn out, after Simone had finally fallen asleep and she began having that really intense dream about a crown of thorns being dug into her scalp, well, in reality, something was digging into her scalp and it was kind of manifesting itself in her dream. And what was digging into her scalp was the jaws of a fox. This fox had snuck into the campsite and walked right up behind Simone and just started eating her head. And amazingly, it did not wake Simone up right away. And so this fox got 20 or so serious bites out of Simone's head before she shot up and scared it away. And so almost certainly what Simone saw running away from her in that quick moment was the fox. Doctors were able to save Simone and stitch her head back together, and they were even able to hide all of the scars in her hairline so you can't even see them. But despite her being physically okay today, psychologically, this was a very traumatizing event. Not only does she refuse now to go into any forest, whether it's day or night, but she also periodically still gets phantom pains in her scalp that feels like the fox is biting her head all over again. Located on the far northern tip of Maine, right on the border of Canada, lies a small rural town called Van Buren. Van Buren is home to about 2,000 people who, for the most part, have lived in Maine for their entire lives, and they tend to be very rugged and very competent people. But unless you live in Van Buren or know someone in Van Buren or have family out there, there's no reason you would have heard of this particular town. Nothing really happens in this town, at least nothing that makes headlines. However, that would change. In 2019, Van Buren made international headlines because of one man, Ronald Sear. As a young man in the 1950s, Ronald Sear joined the Air Force and fought in the Korean War. And then after he got out of the military, he moved back to his hometown of Van Buren, Maine, and he moved into a very modest 2-story home right near town. And for a little while, he just kind of floated about, didn't really have a direction in life. But eventually, because of his love for working with his hands and his general skill at working with his hands and building things, he started a small but successful tool selling company that he ran right out of his shed on his property. Fast forward to 2019, Ronald Sear at that time was 65 years old, and he still lived in the same property right near town in Van Buren. However, he now lived alone, and he still ran this tool selling business right out of his work shed. And for Ronald, this was enough. He was very content with his life. He was very happy. But that year, he would face a crisis. One bright, sunny morning in the summer of that year, Ronald left his house and he walked over to his shed. He went inside, and right away he noticed something. Ronald kept all these bins inside of his shed that were full of all of the different tools that he would sell. And because he was in there all the time, either literally selling tools or tinkering with whatever it was he was building himself, he was very aware of how full each of these bins were. And anytime they got low, he would order more so he had enough supply to sell. And so he went into his shed this morning and he noticed right away that a couple of the bins appeared to be a little bit lower than he remembered. And right away, Ronald is thinking, did I forget to order supplies to fill these bins up? Did I just forget to do that? but he's thinking to himself, I am meticulous in making sure my inventory is full at all times. I've been doing this for decades, and so it can't be me. Maybe I took the tools and I brought them into my house and I've left them in there, or maybe they're in my truck. And so Ronald, believing there's a totally logical explanation for this, would leave his shed and he would search his property, but he can't find these tools anywhere. And so he began calling his family and his friends to see if, maybe they had come by and borrowed some of these tools, or maybe they knew what had happened to them. But everyone he spoke to said, no, I have no idea. And so by that afternoon, Ronald had found himself back inside of his work shed looking around, thinking to himself, have I been robbed? It was the only logical thing he could think of that would explain this loss. And so Ronald drove to the police station and he spoke to police and he explained what happened. But unfortunately, the police's reaction to what he was telling them was not exactly what he wanted. They basically assumed that, he just had miscounted, that in reality, the tools were either still in the shed and he just forgot how many were supposed to be in there, or he had just kind of lost them on his property somewhere, that they were bound to turn up. And so the police told him, look, Ronald, go back and search your property. I'm sure they're there. And if you get some proof that someone actually stole from you, then come back to us. And so Ronald was really annoyed by this. He wanted them to take this seriously, but he could tell they just were not going to. And so Ronald drove back to his house, he went inside, he hopped on his computer, and he began researching what other homeowners did to protect themselves from things like theft. And one of the things he came across was setting up tripwires all around the perimeter of your property. Basically, you take these thin wires and you stretch them out very tight, very low to the ground, and you anchor them on each side, and then on the wire itself, you hang little bells. And so in theory, if an intruder were to walk onto your property, they would most likely not see the tripwires on the ground and they would kick them, and that would cause the bells to ring, thereby alerting the homeowner of their presence. Ronald loved this idea, so he went out and he set up tripwires all around his property. But over the next several days, after these wires were stood up, none of the wires made any sound, and still more tools continued to go missing. This was also in spite of the fact that his shed was locked at night. And so Ronald's thinking to himself, whoever's doing this is clearly watching me and kind of monitoring what I'm doing. They must be aware of the tripwires, and they must be sneaking into the shed, at some time that I have the doors unlocked. I mean, this is a professional thief. And so as Ronald is thinking about this master thief that is targeting him, he has this sudden fear that if he can't stop this person from breaking into his shed and taking his tools, how can he possibly protect himself against this person breaking into his home and stealing things from in there, which included all of his cash and many other valuables? And so Ronald became very fearful and decided the only thing he could do was really beef up his home security system. And so he hopped back online and he began Googling other ways to protect your property. And after discovering a number of really effective techniques, he got to work. He began building all these home defense systems and placing them all around his property. And after all of these kind of DIY security measures were put up, the theft of his tools stopped. And in Ronald's mind, that validated that his defense system had worked. He was effectively preventing theft. But this would not be the end of his troubles. Fast forward to Thanksgiving that year, so November 28th, and the Van Buren police got a very frantic phone call from Ronald. He was totally hysterical, he wasn't really making sense, and the police, they tried to understand what was going on, but all they could get from Ronald was that he was requesting police to come to his residence immediately. And so the police, they hang up and they're thinking, okay, we know Ronald was dealing with a potential thief. Maybe he literally caught the thief red-handed and he wants us to come and arrest this person, and who knows, maybe they're fighting at his residence right now. And so the police speed over to Ronald's house, they pull into his driveway, and at first glance, nothing looks out of the ordinary. Ronald's truck is in the driveway, and there's no obvious signs of a disturbance, but they notice the front door to Ronald's house is wide open. And so the police park their cars in Ronald's driveway, they get out and they run up onto the front porch, and they're standing in front of this open door, and they look down and they can see there's a very obvious blood trail starting from from the front of Ronald's house, going straight back down a hallway that looped around to the left and out of sight. And so right away, the police are yelling into the house, Ronald, are you okay? What's going on? And somewhere deep inside of the house, they hear what sounds like Ronald make a kind of guttural sound. And so immediately this tips the police that more than likely Ronald has been hurt, and he likely is the one who made this blood trail. And so the police draw their guns and they go inside of Ronald's house, not really sure what they're going to find. They don't know if there's some intruder or attacker or someone in here that's harmed Ronald, but they make their way down this hall following the blood trail. They turn the corner, and then sitting at the end of the blood trail is Ronald. He's sitting down with his back to some cabinets in the kitchen, and he's clutching his midsection. He is covered in blood. He's completely pale. And so right away, the officers call in backup, but then as a security measure, they search the rest of the first floor to make sure there is no other person here. There was no one on the first floor. They went to the second floor. They peeked around up there. They didn't see anyone. So they rushed back down to Ronald, who's still just sitting there, and they begin administering first aid, and they're trying to get him to explain what happened. How did you get hurt? But Ronald is clearly in shock. He's kind of in a daze. He's not making sense. And then by the time the paramedics showed up just a couple of minutes later, Ronald had slipped into unconsciousness. When Ronald was wheeled out of the house, the responding officers and the backup officers, who by now had arrived, decided to search the rest of Ronald's house to see if there was some clue as to what had happened. And so they began searching in the kitchen, looking around, but there wasn't anything that stood out to them. And then they began walking around towards the living room. And when they got into the living room, one of the officers suddenly screamed to everyone inside to stop where they were, stop moving. It would turn out Ronald, as part of his very beefed up home security system, had installed various booby traps all around his property, including inside of his house. And some of these traps were gun booby traps. The officer that had yelled for everyone to stop had spotted one of these traps. He saw a handgun anchored to the ceiling aimed at the front door, and there was a string attached to the trigger that was also then attached to the doorknob of the front door. And so if this trap were live and some person opened the front door, it would activate this trap, causing the gun to shoot them. And so clearly Ronald had accidentally left this particular booby trap on, and he had accidentally activated it, shooting himself. And so after the officer sees this gun anchored to the ceiling, he tells everyone, and they begin looking up and just looking around to see if there are other traps. And amazingly, there are. In other doorways, just from where they're standing, they can see the barrels of guns pointing down that are obvious booby traps. In their haste to get in there and figure out what was going on, they hadn't noticed all of these guns in the ceiling, and so it was just kind of a miracle that none of the other traps had been set off. Ronald would be rushed to the hospital that night, but he would pass away from his wound. His death would be ruled an accident, and to this day, we don't know if he really was dealing with a professional thief that was stealing his tools, or if it was just a fake. In 2008, 22-year-old Julian Buchwald was living in a small rural town in southern Australia called Budgeree. He lived there with his parents, who owned a small house on a massive 1,200-acre plot of land, which for reference is about 2 square miles. However, this land was made up mostly of thick brush and forested areas, so for the most part, they just stayed close to their actual house. However, there was a waterfall deep into the woods on their property that periodically they would go to visit. Less than a 20-minute drive north of Budgeree was another small rural town called Churchill, and in that town was Julian's girlfriend, 17-year-old Carolyn Watson, who also lived with her parents. The young couple had met 2 years earlier at the church they both went to. They were both very devout Christians, and their plan was to get married the next year when Carolyn turned 18 and was done with her studies. On Tuesday, March 4th of that year, Julian and Carolyn decided to go out and have a picnic lunch at the waterfall on Julian's family's property. So early that afternoon, Julian left his house, he hopped in the family car, he drove north to Churchill, he picked up Carolyn, and then he drove her back to his family's property, where he turned onto a dirt road that would take them into the forest to the waterfall. At some point along this short, bumpy road through the forest, Julian was looking out ahead of the car when he spotted what looked like roadkill roadkill on the side of the road. And this roadkill, it looked bigger than he was used to seeing in this area. And so he stared at it as the car kind of rolled past it. And right after they had driven past the roadkill, he turned to Carolyn and said, hey, there's some really weird roadkill on the side of the road right over there. And so Carolyn, who really didn't care, she kind of slowly looked up and turned around and looked, but she didn't see it. And then after that, the two of them did not discuss the roadkill any further. And so Julian just continued to drive along this dirt road until the road kind of opened up into this big clearing. And in the middle of this clearing, which was basically this field, there was a small pond with a 10-foot high waterfall feeding into it. This was the waterfall. And so Julian parked the car right at the end of the dirt road, right on the edge of this clearing. And he and Carolyn got out. They went around to the back of the car. They got their picnic supplies out of the trunk, and they set up their picnic lunch right on the edge of this pond, looking up at this waterfall. And they were there for about an hour, just kind of enjoying each other's company. And then around 2:30 p.m., they realized it was time to go because they had told their family they'd be back by 3. And so they packed up all of their picnic stuff. They went back to the car. They put it back in the trunk. They hopped back inside the car. Julian turned it on. He turned the car around, and they began driving back down the dirt road that had brought them in. And as soon as they began driving down this road, Julian remembered the strange roadkill he had seen on their way in. And he decided that he wanted to stop and get out and actually go up to it. And so as they're driving along, he looks over at Carolyn and says, "Hey, do you mind if I stop the car when I see the roadkill so I can go look at it?" Carolyn looked at him and she's like, "Okay, but remember, we have to be back by 3 p.m. That's what we told our families, so please be quick." And so Julian said, "No problem." And so he continued driving along, scanning for this roadkill. But after driving for several minutes, he had not found the roadkill yet. And he started to become worried that he had just driven past it without realizing it. And so he stopped the car. They're pretty close to the end of this dirt road. They're almost back to Julian's property, but he stops the car right in the middle of this dirt road. And he turns to Carolyn and says, "Hey, I think I drove past it. Do you mind if I just hop out and run back?" And so Carolyn was totally annoyed that this roadkill viewing was really becoming quite involved. But she says, "Okay, go. But again, you got to be quick because, it's almost 3 p.m. And so Julian kind of grinned at her. He put the car in park and he hopped out, he turned, and he began jogging back down the road in the direction of the waterfall. And after jogging for maybe 30 seconds or so, the road had turned to the right. And so from where he was on the road, if he turned around, he would not have been able to see his car or Carolyn. He was kind of deep in the thick of this forest. But he knew, this road is not very long, and so I'm sure the roadkill has got to be up here somewhere. And so he decided he would just continue running back along this road for maybe 1 or 2 more minutes, and if he didn't find the roadkill by then, he'd just have to give up, turn around, and head back to the car. And so he began jogging, continuing towards the waterfall on this dirt road. And sure enough, after about a minute, he spots off to the side the roadkill. And so he runs up to it, and right away he sees it's this huge animal that's right on the side of the road. There was a branch from a tree that had kind of obscured the carcass a little bit. And he figured that's why on the return trip he hadn't seen it, because this branch was kind of blocking it from view. And so standing over it, still not even sure what it is, he reached down and he moved the branch, the tree branch, out of the way to get a better look at this big dead animal. And right as he did that, everything went black. A few minutes later, Carolyn, who was still sitting in the car waiting for her boyfriend to come back, looked at her watch and realized it was getting really close to 3 p.m. and still Julian was not back yet. And so feeling kind of annoyed with him, she sat up in her seat and turned around and looked out the rear window of the car, expecting to see Julian come bounding down the road toward her. But when she looked out the back window, all she saw was this dirt road that kind of bent off to the right out of view and thick trees everywhere. Her boyfriend is nowhere to be seen. Annoyed, she turned back around and sat facing forward again, but began periodically looking in the side view mirror, expecting Julian to pop up at any moment. But after several more minutes went by and still Julian had not come back yet, her annoyance turned into concern. Was Julian actually okay? And so she decided, it's almost 3 p.m. now. We got to get back. I need to get out and actually go investigate and see what's going on with Julian and this roadkill. And so she opened her car door. She stepped outside. She stood up. She turned and she looked down the road in the direction it turned to the right towards the waterfall. and she froze because there was something standing right in the middle of the road that her brain simply couldn't process. She wanted to turn and run. She wanted to scream for help, but she couldn't. She was just frozen with fear, staring at this thing in the middle of the road. And then seconds later, this thing that she saw in the road began moving toward her. Around 3:30 p.m. that day, Julian's mother, who was at the house, realized her son had still not come back from his picnic. And this was very unlike him. He was extremely punctual. And so she stepped out onto the front porch to wait for him. But after waiting on the front porch for 30 minutes and him not showing up again, she got really concerned. And so she left the porch and went down onto their driveway, and their driveway extended right up to the main road that ran along the front of the house. And when she reached the top of her driveway, she just turned and watched down the main road, waiting for her son to come back. Because in order to get to the waterfall, you had to get on this main road and then turn onto that dirt road that was a little ways down this main road. And so she's just standing there looking down the road, waiting for her son, but he's still not coming out of that dirt road. And as she's looking in this direction, she happens to glance along the chain link fence that ran along the front of her property. And she noticed there was a plastic bottle that had been jammed through one of the chain links. And so she decided she would just go over and see what it was, because it didn't make any sense that there would be a bottle in her fence. And so she walks over, she pulls the bottle out of the fence, and she realizes there is a tightly rolled piece of paper that's inside of the bottle. And so she unscrews the cap, she turns the bottle over, and she pours this little piece of paper out. She unfurls the piece of paper and sees there's writing on it. And as she's reading it, her heart starts to race and she covers her mouth. This note was clearly intended for her to read, or someone in the family to read that day, because it was about what happened to Julian and Carolyn that day. The note, which was covered in all these strange satanic symbols and was barely understandable because the grammar and spelling was so terrible, it generally communicated that Julian and Carolyn, who they called the boy and the girl, had been kidnapped. And so long as the family did not contact police, they, the boy and the girl, Julian and Carolyn, would be returned. It didn't really specify what they were going to do to them, and there was no ransom. It basically just said, you better not tell police or else. Well, Julian's mother was terrified. She had no idea what to do, and despite this threat of some sort of harm to her, to her children, to her family, if she went to police, she still called the police. And so the police, they came out to her property, they inspected the note, and right away, they noticed at the bottom of the note, it was signed with the initials ONA. And so those initials, combined with these strange satanic symbols all over it, led police to discover who ONA was. ONA was a cult. It was the Order of Nine Angles, and they are a self-professed satanic cult that operates primarily in Europe, but also has chapters in the United States, in Canada, in Russia, and also in Australia. This cult believes that Christians are the enemy of the world, and they need to be destroyed in order to institute a militaristic New World Order they called the Imperium. And if that wasn't frightening enough, this cult openly advocates for, and apparently practices, human sacrifice. They have come out and said the people they kill in these sacrifices are people they consider lesser thans, basically the bad people of society. And if you are an ONA cult member, then who better to sacrifice than Julian and Carolyn, two devout Christians, and so two clear enemies of the ONA. Now, at first, when the police saw this note and kind of put this together, they're thinking, this has got to be a prank. I mean, Carolyn and Julian have only been gone for a couple of hours at this point, and all we have is this note in a bottle stuck into the fence. This does not seem like some huge conspiracy of a cult coming in here and snatching these kids to commit some human sacrifice. But when Carolyn's parents found out about this note and how they were still missing, they would tell the police, 10 days ago, we received a letter in the mail that had strange satanic symbols all over it, and it really didn't make any sense. It basically was threatening them not to go to police, But 10 days ago, they had no reason to go to police. And so they just didn't really understand why they received this message or who had sent it. And so they had just kind of dismissed it and not told anyone. But now, with these two notes looking nearly identical, it seemed fairly obvious that whether it was the ONA or some other person or group, whoever was behind the kidnapping of Julian and Carolyn had clearly been watching both of their properties prior to the attack, which meant this was likely a more sophisticated kidnapping than it seemed. So that evening, the police launched this huge air and land search all over Julian's family's property, but despite looking everywhere, they found no sign of the young couple. There was just nothing. And over the next few days, when still there was just no sign of Julian or Carolyn, and there was no more word coming in from ONA, there were no more bottles stuck in fences or stuck in mailboxes, the police began to prepare for the worst. Then something totally unexpected happened. On March 11th, so 7 days after Carolyn and Julian went missing, a farmer was driving along this winding back road up in the mountains right near Alpine National Park. Alpine National Park is this very rugged, mountainous place that's about 250 miles to the north of Budgery. And so as this guy is driving along this road, which is very heavily forested on either side, he sees up ahead this young man and young woman who are barely wearing any clothes come stumbling out of the forest and kind of plop down on the side of the road. And so concerned they're hurt or they're lost or something, the farmer rolled right up next to them and he rolled his window down and asked, hey, are you guys okay? And they got up and they kind of stumbled their way over to the car and they introduced themselves as Carolyn and Julian and they pleaded for his help. And so the farmer helped them into his car and he drove them to the hospital. It wasn't long before the police in Budgery learned that Carolyn and Julian had been found and they were alive. And so very quickly they rushed up to that hospital near the national park. And when they got there, they spoke to doctors who would say, Carolyn and Julian are very traumatized. They're horribly sunburned. They're covered in bug bites. They got cuts and bruises all over them, but they're okay. They're going to survive. And so the police went into Julian and Carolyn's room. And at first, they just talked to them for a couple of minutes to really see that they were okay. And after feeling pretty confident that they were, they said, look, I don't mean to just jump right into the trauma you've just experienced, but we really need any information you can give us about what just happened. Who did this to you? Who brought you out here? Because if it's ONA and they're out in the Alpine National Park, we need to know about it, we need to get out there, and we need to stop them. And so Julian and Carolyn would both independently sit down and tell the police what happened to them. And so the following is the combined story of these two accounts that they gave police. And so again, here is the account that both Julian and Carolyn gave to police. 7 days earlier, when Julian had gotten out of the car and ran back down the road to that dead animal on the side of the road, and he had reached down to kind of get that branch out of the way to get a better look at this thing, he heard sudden movement behind him, and as he turned, he didn't have a chance to see what was behind him, but he felt something hard smash him in the back of the head, and it knocked him unconscious. When he woke up, he knew right away that a significant amount of time had passed, that he had been unconscious for what must have been several hours, because now it was dark out, and when he was struck, it was broad daylight, and he looked around him, and he had no idea where he was. He was in the middle of this forest, he had no clothes on, his wrists and his ankles were tied together, and he moved around, and he realized he had been tied to a tree that was right behind him. And so he's got no idea what's going on, he has no idea where he is, he's looking around, he doesn't see anyone, and then amazingly, when he looks down, right next to him, underneath some leaves, is a knife. And so he's thinking, how in the world is there a knife right next to me? This almost seems like it was placed to be here for me. But either way, he reaches down with his hands, he picks this knife up, and he's able to cut the restraints off of his ankles, and then he's able to cut the restraints off of his waist, and then he stands up, and he's able to kind of cut off the ones on his wrist, and then he's free. And so he takes this knife, and he has no idea where he's going, but he needs to get away. He doesn't know if whoever brought him here is going to come back. And so he just picks a direction, and he starts running. Shortly after Julian had been struck in the back of the head after looking at that dead animal carcass, Carolyn was still sitting in the car, and she was starting to get annoyed and kind of worried about Julian. And so she gets out of the car, she stands up, she turns, and she looks down the dirt road where it kind of bends off to the right. and standing in the road, maybe 10 feet away from her, is this man wearing all black. He's got a black balaclava over his face, and he's looking right at her. And so she's so scared, she just frozen to the spot. And then this guy charges her, he tackles her to the ground, and then once she's on the ground, he rips all her clothes off, and then he binds her wrists, her ankles, he ties them together so she's hogtied, and then he puts a blindfold around her eyes. And so she's lying on the road, she can't move, she can't see anything, and she hears her attacker run off down the road. And then a couple of minutes later, she hears a car approaching that stops right near her, and then she hears the sound of a car door opening, someone walking up to her, and then they pick her up and they put her in the trunk of this car. They shut the trunk, and then the car kicks into gear and it starts driving away. And so for hours and hours, she lay in the trunk in this horrible position where the circulation to her wrists and to her ankles were cut off. And so she's getting shooting pain in her limbs, and it's totally uncomfortable. And then after several hours, the car eventually turns on to some really bumpy road, and then it comes to a stop. And then she hears the sound of the driver open the door. They walk around to the back of the car. The trunk pops open. And then this person pulls the blindfold off of her eyes. And she sees, even though her eyes are taking a second to adjust, that it's the man with the balaclava on. And he picks her up and he throws her on the ground. And then after he shuts the trunk, he walks over to Carolyn and he grabs her by the wrists and he begins dragging her into the woods. And so as she's being dragged, Carolyn is thinking, I'm about to be killed somewhere in the middle of the woods. There's nothing I can do. I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything. And after several minutes of being dragged, she gets dropped. And then this man with the balaclava, he walks back to the car and he gets a shovel. And when he walks over to her, he makes a special point of showing her the shovel. And then he rolls her onto her side so she's positioned in such a way that she can see what he's doing. And then right in front of her, he takes that shovel and he begins digging a hole in the ground. And so Carolyn's watching him and she's thinking, he's digging my grave. And so for several hours, Carolyn just laid there wondering what was going to happen to her as this guy dug this hole deeper and deeper into the ground. And then finally, when the hole was apparently deep enough, the guy got out of the hole, he dumped the shovel, he walked over to her, he picked her up, and he threw her into the hole. And so Carolyn at this point is literally anticipating death at any moment. She doesn't know how he's going to kill her, but she thinks it's going to happen any minute. And so she wriggles herself onto her knees and does the only thing she can think to do, which is just to pray. And so as she's sitting there kneeling and praying, she hears the sound of her attacker walking off. Now, the hole was deep enough that she actually could not see where he was going, but she could clearly tell he was walking away. It was almost like her prayer had been answered, that this guy was going to leave her alone. But even with this guy potentially gone, she was still in a perilous situation because she's stuck in this hole. She can't go anywhere. She's still tied up, and the temperatures are dropping rapidly, and she's got no clothes on. After Julian had managed to free himself from his restraints with that knife that he found, and after he had turned and just started running in a general direction, he had begun yelling out for help. He knew that by yelling out, he very likely could be alerting the person who had brought him here, but he's thinking, it's freezing, I don't have clothes on, I have to get help right now, and maybe Carolyn is out there. And so he's just kind of yelling out for help. And at some point, a voice yells back to him, and it's a voice he knows very well. It's Carolyn. And so in the darkness, he's kind of fumbling through all the trees, and he's listening for Carolyn's voice. And finally, he reaches her, and he finds her in this hole, hogtied, screaming out for him. And so there's this moment where he kind of explains what happened to him, and she's trying to explain what happened to her, but they're just so scared that this attacker is going to come back that Julian just hops into the hole, he cuts her restraints, and then Julian helps Carolyn out of the hole. And at this point, Carolyn can barely walk because the circulation had been cut off for the most part to her legs for the better part of 6, 7, 8 hours at this point. But still, they're desperate to get out of here. So Julian's kind of holding Carolyn up, and they begin to walk away from this hole site. And as they're leaving, they begin scanning around the area in case, this attacker has left something else on the ground, because Julian had said, I found a knife near where I was being held. And sure enough, as they're leaving, not far from the hole, they spot lying up against a tree a sleeping bag, and rolled up inside of the sleeping bag was some food and some water. And so Julian and Carolyn, they can't understand how in the world this has happened. Both the horrible luck of being kidnapped and brought out here, and the unbelievable luck of finding life-saving supplies just laying nearby. But either way, they grab the sleeping bag, they grab the food and water, and they take off running. For the next 48 hours, the couple roasted during the daytime when the sun was out because the temperatures would climb significantly. There wasn't much shade where they were walking around, so they're getting horribly sunburned. And then at night, the temperatures would plummet and they'd be freezing cold, and they'd get inside of their one sleeping bag and they'd shiver together and do their best to ration some food and water. And they're telling themselves, to stay positive, that eventually if they just keep on moving every day, they're going to find a person, they're going to find a road, they're going to find something that will save them. But to their horror, at the end of those first 48 hours, as they're stumbling through this mountainous, treacherous terrain, they found themselves stumbling back into the same area they had tried to run away from. There was the hole in the ground where Carolyn had been thrown inside of. They had accidentally, over the past 2 days, walked in a big circle. Now, luckily, when they arrived back at this site, there was no one there. The attacker was long gone. And it would turn out this accident likely saved their lives, because as they looked at this site, they saw propped up against a tree was a backpack. And so they ran over to the backpack, they opened it up, and there was food, water, some clothing, and a map of the area. Now, again, the couple is totally dumbfounded why they are just happening to find these life-saving supplies right when they need them. But at the same time, they're thinking, okay, well, if these supplies are sitting here, then certainly the person who has left them here, their attacker, they're going to be back soon. And so they just grabbed the backpack with everything inside of it and they took off running. And for the next 5 days, they used that map as best as they could, and they eventually stumbled their way through the terrain, roasting during the daytime and freezing at night. And eventually they reached that road where they stumbled out, and the farmer driving along the back road, he spotted them and he brought them to the hospital. After hearing this story, the police very quickly organized a massive search around the area of Alpine National Park where the farmer picked up Julian and Carolyn, because they're thinking, okay, it's got to be right around here that we'll find the man in the balaclava that might lead us to the ONA, or maybe he's not connected to the ONA, but whoever he is, we need to find this guy. And so the police, they go out, they do this huge search. They don't find the man with the balaclava. They don't find any sign of the ONA, but they do find that area where that hole had been dug that Carolyn had been thrown in. And when they searched that area, they found the shovel, they found some rope, and they found some duct tape. And when they brought that in to be examined, they couldn't believe what they discovered. All of those items belonged to Julian, which meant either the kidnapper had taken all of these supplies from Julian right before going out and perpetrating this kidnapping, or, much more likely, Julian had supplied these things to the kidnapper and so was involved in some way in this kidnapping. And so the police went to Julian and confronted him with this information and said, "You're not telling us everything because these are your items." And at first, Julian would completely deny any accusations that he had anything to do with this. But after some very serious police pressure was put on him, he cracked. The following is the real story of what happened. Back on March 4th, so the day that Julian and Carolyn went missing, Julian, after picking Carolyn up, they made it onto that dirt road that led into the forest towards the waterfall, and as they're driving along, Julian claimed to have seen some roadkill, some very strange roadkill on the side of the road. And so when Carolyn kind of turned around to look and didn't see it, Julian made it seem like, oh, well, we drove past it, that's why you didn't see it. But in reality, there was never any roadkill. That was completely made up. There was no roadkill. All Julian was doing was creating something that would allow him to then get out of the car at the end of their trip. And so they drive the rest of the way into the waterfall, they have their picnic, they turn around, they head back, and then again, Julian says, "Hey, Carolyn, do you mind if I, get out to look at the roadkill?" And so she says yes, and then he acts like, "Oh, we must have driven past it, so I need to get out and run back if I want to go see it." So Carolyn, she's not thinking it's totally strange. She says, okay, and so he hops out and he runs his way, he goes around that curve in the road, out of sight. There's no roadkill. Instead, he makes his way to a tree where days earlier he had stashed his all-black outfit, his black balaclava, and his knife, his shovel, his rope, his duct tape. It was all stashed in this spot that was going to be out of view of where Carolyn was. And so after getting all dressed up, he turned and began walking back towards Carolyn and his car. And when he turned the corner, he saw Carolyn was already standing outside of the car. And so he charged her, he tackled her to the ground, he ripped her clothes off, off, he hogtied her, he threw her in his car, and then he got all of his supplies, he threw those in the car too, and he began driving away. And for 6 hours, he drove north all the way up to Alpine National Park. And then when he got there, he found a road that would kind of go off the trail a ways into the forest, at which point he opened the trunk, he pulled Carolyn out, he threw her on the ground, he dragged Carolyn into the woods, and then with her blindfold off, he made sure to show her the shovel, and he began digging that hole to give her the impression that he was going to kill her and bury her. He really wanted her to be totally terrified. And then after he had dug this hole, he dumped her into the hole. And then when she couldn't see what he was doing because she's deep inside of this hole and she's all tied up, he ran away. And when he was far enough out of view, he took off all of his clothes and kind of stashed it near a tree. And then completely naked, besides his knife, which would be his alibi for how he had gotten free, he began moving back towards the site where he knew Carolyn was in this hole. And then after waiting a little bit, he began yelling out for help. And then she heard it. And so she yells back to him, "Yo, Julian, I'm over here." And so Julian goes to the sound of her voice. And then when he sees her, he pitches her this ridiculous story about how he was tied up over there, but he found this knife and he was able to cut himself free. And look, I'll cut you free. Oh, the attacker's going to come back soon. And so he helps her out of the hole. And oh, look, they left a sleeping bag and some food and water. Let's go. And so he grabs the supplies and they head off into the bush. Now, the whole time over the course of these 7 days, Julian knew exactly where he was. And so when they accidentally went in a circle and arrived back at the site where the hole was and then found that backpack that had more food and more water and some more supplies, that was intentional. That was not an accident. He had left the backpack there, and so that's why they had doubled back. And then 5 days later, after scampering through the wilderness, they magically found the road. But again, Julian knew where the road was. He had intentionally stayed out for the days that they were out there. And so after Julian tells the police all this, they say to him, was Carolyn in on this? I mean, did she know this was going on? And he said no. The whole time she believed they were getting stalked by their attacker. And if they ever caught up to them, they would be killed. And so the police are like, okay, well, why did you do this? Julian would say, he and Carolyn were both very committed to their faith, and they both believed in not having sex before marriage. But over time, Julian had gotten to the point where he just couldn't wait any longer to have sex with Carolyn, and they weren't scheduled to get married for another year. And he just did not think he could wait a full year before they could finally have intercourse. And so he had staged this entire kidnapping in order to hopefully coerce Carolyn into having sex with him. And so while he and Carolyn were out on the run in Alpine National Park for those 7 days and nights, they were not wearing any clothes or barely wearing any clothes. And at night, they only had that one sleeping bag that Julian had intentionally staged in advance. He knew they would have that one sleeping bag. And so they would climb into that bag at night because it's freezing cold out. And as they're laying there right on top of each other, he would say to Carolyn, "We need to have sex in order to produce enough heat that we don't freeze to death out here." But Carolyn, despite the circumstances, every time said no. And so after 7 days of trying to convince Carolyn that they had to have sex, it was a matter of life or death, and that if they just said their vows, that under the eyes of God, they would be considered married and sex would be okay at that point, despite all of his best efforts, every single time, Carolyn just continued to say no, no, no. And so at the end of those 7 days, Julian finally just gave up. And so that's when they magically made their way out to the road and were rescued. Julian would also tell police that he was the one who wrote those notes prior to the kidnapping in hopes that they would believe the Order of the Nine Angles was behind all of this and he wouldn't get in trouble. Prior to his trial for kidnapping, Julian was out on bail and he decided he would just try to flee Australia. And so the way he did this is he dyed his skin a darker shade, and he also dyed his hair darker, and then he attempted to use a fake Indian passport to go to India. And he was able to fool Australian authorities, but when he arrived in India, he was immediately found out and he was extradited back to Australia where he would stand trial. And in 2009, he was found guilty of kidnapping along with a host of other obscure charges, and he was sentenced to 7 years and 9 months. In Nigeria, motorcycle taxi drivers are called Okadas, and in Ibadan, which is one of Nigeria's biggest cities, home to 3.5 million people, there are a lot of Okadas. However, despite their massive numbers, these Ibadan Okadas are actually a fairly tight-knit community made up primarily of young men. And so in early 2014, when 2 of these Okadas went missing, the community immediately found out about it and was really concerned. And when the police did not appear to be doing much to actually go out and find these 2 guys, the community of Okadas decided to launch a search of their own. Basically, as they went about their day, driving around the city, dropping fares off, all of these Okadas would be going down side streets and looking in back alleys and checking all over the city for their missing members. But despite their best efforts, they never could find them. Then, on March 22nd of that year, a 3rd Ibadan Okada vanished. He was a young man named Lanre Sidiku, and unlike the other 2 riders who went missing while they were at home, Lanre went missing while he was working. Lanre was part of a group of Okadas within the city who all kind of met up on the same city street, and that's where they stayed throughout the course of their day, trying to wave down fares as they came up. And so everyone in that meetup point all knew each other, and so they all knew Lanre. And on the day he went missing, they recalled seeing him driving away from this meetup point with 2 passengers on the back of his bike. Now, typically, the rides these Okadas would offer to their passengers were very short. They're only driving them just around the city. And so it was very quickly noticed that Lanre had left and after several hours had still not come back yet. When it was noticed by the other Okadas, they began talking about it and someone said, give him a call, make sure he's okay. And so they called his cell phone and Lanre did not pick up, which was highly unusual, not just for Lanre, but amongst the other Okadas. They always have their phones on because they're looking for new customers and customers could be calling them. And so their cell phone is a vital part of their work. And so his phone is off. They don't really know what to make of that. And then out of nowhere, Lanre actually calls this group of riders. However, he was calling them on his second cell phone. Lanre would keep a work phone and a personal phone. So he was calling them on his personal phone. And so when this other Okada answered the phone and heard Lanre's voice, he put the phone on speaker so the others who were concerned could hear what was going on. And what they heard was Lanre, totally hysterical, screaming into the phone that he needed help. He said that he and 8 other people he was with, who he didn't even know, had been kidnapped, and their kidnappers had brought them to this underground prison cell. They couldn't see anything, but they could hear people walking above them. Lanre also explained that when they had been kidnapped, the captors had taken all of their belongings, but they hadn't recognized that Lanre had this secondary cell phone, which is why he was calling from it. And so in between Lanre's frantic descriptions of what was going on and what had happened to him, these Okadas that received this call, they can hear in the background these other 8 people that are with Lanre in this underground cell screaming out as loud as they can, probably to get the attention of someone, anyone who was above ground who might be able to come down and save them. And so these Okada riders who are getting this call from Lanre, they're horrified and they're trying to calm Lanre down so he can explain where he is so they can go find him. And finally, Lanre, he does compose himself and he gives them really specific directions to this footpath that led into the Soka forest where he said he had been taken. The Soka forest was a very dense stretch of wilderness right on the outskirts of Ibadan. Lanre would tell them that he had no idea where specifically in the Soka forest he was. However, he said, if you just keep walking on that path, eventually you'll hear us calling out from underground and you can come and save us. And so as the riders turned on their bikes and they got ready to head out and go rescue their friend, they told Lanre to stay on the line. Let us keep talking to you until we find you. But as they're telling him that, his phone abruptly cuts out. And then when they tried calling him back, his phone was off. About 40 Okadas from Lanre's meetup spot took off together and sped down city streets until they hit this major highway that would take them out of the city. And then once they were out of the city, they went down this other road that brought them right towards the Soka forest. And then as this road put them right up against the tree line on their left side of the Soka forest, they all began looking for the 2 burned out cars that Lanre had said marked the beginning of this footpath they were looking for. And so sure enough, they find these burned out cars, they park all their bikes off on the shoulder of the road, and they quickly realize that this really is a footpath only. There's no way they can get their motorcycles onto the path, not only because the burned out cars are blocking their way, but because the path itself is so overgrown with vegetation. I mean, they can barely see the path, let alone drive something through it. And so the men leave their bikes by the side of the road, and then unarmed, they walk walk past the burned out cars onto this path, and then because it was so narrow, they had to walk more or less in a single file line into the Soka forest. And so as these men are basically marching into the woods, they're not making any sound, because again, they're trying to listen for the sound of their friend and the other people that have been taken captive somewhere underground. And so they're silently marching through this forest when all of a sudden the guy at the front of the line thinks he hears something way up ahead. And so he holds his hand up to stop the line, and they all stop and they're trying to listen. And then all of a sudden, about 50 feet ahead of them through the trees, this man they didn't recognize suddenly jumped out from behind a tree. He yelled something at them, and then he raised his gun and began firing in their direction. The 40 Okadas immediately turn around and just sprint back down the path, right back out to the road. They hop on their bikes and they peel back out towards the city. When they finally get back to the meetup spot they had all originated from, they realize they can't just leave Lanre and the other people he was with out to dry. They have to go back and rescue them. They considered calling the police, but given the lackluster response to the other two missing Okadas, they realized they probably would have a higher chance of saving their friend and the others if they just went themselves. And so the 40 Okadas rounded up another 60 from other neighboring meetup spots, and this huge posse of over 100 men all hopped on their bikes and headed back towards that footpath that led into the forest. When they got there, they put their bikes on the side of the road, and this time, when they started walking down that path, they had guns, knives, bats, all sorts of weapons, and they were not trying to be quiet. They were actually yelling like these loud war cries to let the gunmen and any other gunmen in the woods know that there was a horde of angry people that were coming into the woods for a fight. And so as they're marching down this trail, kind of expecting to get shot at any point, it doesn't happen. Instead, after quite a while, they walk out of the thick forest into this huge opening. And right in the middle of this huge clearing is this fairly small river, but it's big enough that it would be very difficult to cross. However, they can see there's a bridge, this kind of crumbling old stone bridge that goes over this river. And then on the other side of the bridge, on the other side of the river, they can see there are two dilapidated buildings. The one that is closer to the bridge is this small black shack that has a window looking out towards them, and from their perspective, they're maybe 100 feet away from the shack. They can't tell if anybody's inside of this building. And then the other building was much bigger than the shack. It was this huge kind of broken down warehouse that had big tall cement walls, and then all around it was this huge chain link fence with barbed wire wrapped around the tops. And so this huge posse of Okadas, they come storming out of the forest and they run over to that bridge, which is the one way across. And as they get on the bridge, they're kind of scanning the two buildings. They're not seeing anybody. And then one of the men, they look down underneath the bridge and they actually see Lanre's motorcycle. It's lying on the banks of this river, kind of tucked up underneath the bridge as if someone had stolen it. And so everyone already knows Lanre is somewhere over here. We're going to go find him. And so the men, they get over the bridge, they go to that first building, that black shack, and they open up the door. It's a plywood door, and there's no one inside, but the shack is literally stuffed full of hundreds and hundreds of articles of clothing and shoes. And so after kind of looking this over and not really sure what to make of it, the posse moved on from the black shack and made their way up to the fence right in front of this huge warehouse. And when they reach the fence, they're kind of expecting to be met with some sort of resistance. I mean, the last time they were out here, they got shot at. And so they begin yelling into the warehouse for anyone in there to show yourselves, come out here. But it was silent. And so one of the Okadas that was part of the posse had brought along bolt cutters as a weapon to use as a club if he needed to. But as it happened, he began to use the bolt cutters for their actual purpose, and he bent down and actually cut a huge hole in this fence so they could go in and explore this warehouse. And so after a large percentage of this posse had gotten inside the fence line, they began walking around this huge warehouse to try to find an entrance inside. And so as they're walking, the windows that lead into this warehouse, they're too high up, so you can't actually see what's going on inside. It's silent. There's a pretty bad smell, but they don't really know what to make of this. They walk around this structure, and when they get to the very back, they find an entrance. All it is this big rusted piece of tin metal, like sheet metal, that's propped up against a gap in the walls of the warehouse. And so one of the Okadas grabs this piece of metal and he pushes it out of the way. And then as soon as he did that, a few other Okadas quickly stepped through the threshold into the warehouse, preparing themselves to have to fight potentially if there are gunmen or anybody else inside that might want to do them harm. But as soon as they see what is inside of this warehouse, they immediately lower their weapons and just stare in abject horror. According to the locals who lived actually in the forest relatively near where this warehouse was, they said there was actually another way to get to this particular area, to get to the warehouse. There was another path that was very rough, but it was big enough for one vehicle that came in from the other direction. Now, the locals said they didn't use this path at all. They didn't even know where it originated from. But they said for the last 10 years or more, they have seen one vehicle use this road all the time to get to the warehouse. And it was this black Jeep with black tinted out windows. And they said it would typically show up most nights of the week around 8 p.m. And they said it would just go down the road. It would make its way over to the warehouse area. And then around 9:30 p.m., they would hear or see the black Jeep leaving. Now, none of the locals knew who was driving this Jeep, although they knew it was a man. That was really all they knew. And they had no idea what this man did when he got over near the warehouse. However, for the last 10 years, every time this guy was over near the warehouse from 8 to 9:30 at night, they would typically hear screams coming from that part of the woods, coming from the warehouse. And when the locals brought their concerns to police, the police just kind of blew it off and didn't do anything about it and actually told the people, don't worry about it. And so over the years, the locals had kind of just accepted that this man in his black Jeep and the screams coming from this warehouse were just a part of life. And so no one even reported it anymore. Had the police followed up on the locals' concerns about this Jeep and the screams, they would have discovered that that warehouse was actually a storage facility for a very in-demand and very illegal product. And that man who drove that black Jeep, he would take this illegal product and he would bring it back with him in batches and he would sell it on the black market. When this posse of 100+ Okadas pulled that metal door aside and they stepped into the warehouse, they were not met with any resistance. Anyone that had been there, any other gunmen or guards or anything like that, they had fled when they heard the sound of this massive posse whooping and yelling on their way in. And so as these Okadas are standing inside of this structure surveying what's in front of them, the first thing they noticed is right in the middle of the structure on the ground is this cement slab. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet, and one corner of this slab was elevated slightly by some rocks that had been placed under it, kind of propping it up, pitching it on an angle. And then just off of the side of the lowest point of the slab was this wooden bowl that had dark stains inside of it that was positioned in such a way that if you put water on the slab, the water would drain off of that corner directly into this bowl. Basically, it was there to catch any runoff from whatever was happening on this slab. Around this cement slab, all over the dirt floor, were bones, some with meat on them. And then beyond the bones and beyond the slab, all around the perimeter of the inside of this building were extremely malnourished, catatonic people chained up to the walls. These people were the highly in-demand, highly illegal product. More specifically, their body parts were the product. In Nigeria, a stunning number of people believe that certain magic potions and charms will grant you wealth and success, and in some cases, infinite life. But the catch is, the herbalists who will perform the magical rituals and give these potions and charms to people that pay for them, they often require human body parts for them to work. And so human body part factories, like this warehouse in Soka Forest, were established in order to meet the high demand of people that needed these parts. And so the way it's believed it worked at the Soka Forest warehouse was the man in the black Jeep. He would get orders from people that wanted specific body parts for their magical potions and charms and whatever else they needed, and he would make a list of those parts, and then at 8 p.m. he would show up at the warehouse and he would communicate with the people that worked at that warehouse, and they would determine out of all the captives they had who had the parts they needed. And then after figuring out which captives were going to be used that night, they would go into the main section of the warehouse, and one by one They would unchain these people, they would drag them to the center of the room, and in full view of all the other captives, they would put them on the slab, known as the slaughtering slab, and they would hack off the required body parts, and would bag them up, put them in coolers, and then the man with the black Jeep, he would take those parts and he would leave, and then the person who's just been butchered, if they were still alive and might have a chance of surviving, they'd just be brought back to the wall and chained up again. If they did not have a good chance of survival, then they'd be brought to the very back of the warehouse in the back rooms where they would be discarded. Now, the means of execution varied, but in the back rooms of this warehouse, they found a makeshift guillotine, which cuts off people's heads, and they also found a large crocodile that was chained up. And so it's likely that those were at least two of the methods used to discard of the people they could no longer harvest organs from. After the Okadas kind of broke out of their initial shock of what they were seeing inside of this warehouse, they went around and began freeing people that were still chained up to the walls. And in total, there were 23 people that were still barely alive, still inside of this warehouse, but none of them were Lanre Sadiku. And then after checking all of the dead bodies and body parts that were inside of the warehouse, and then also right outside, where there were a number of shallow mass graves, they couldn't find Lanre amongst them either. And so this huge posse began looking all over the property for an entrance to this underground prison that Lanre had described being in. But they couldn't find it, and so eventually this posse made their way back over to the survivors who were being tended to by locals that had come over, and they asked the survivors, are you aware of any underground prison cells somewhere around here where other people were being held? But the survivors either didn't know or just were unable to speak anymore. And so later that day, when the police did come out, because word got out about this huge find out in this forest, the posse went to the police and begged them to please begin digging up this entire property. We need to find the entrance to this underground prison cell. Lanre and 8 others, and who knows how many others beyond them, are trapped underground in these cells, and we gotta get to them. But the police just kind of refused and immediately just demolished the warehouse. And then after kind of cordoning off that area for a couple of days, the police basically just left and stopped caring about it altogether. And so the Okadas once again came together as a community and would spend the next several weeks going back out to this forest and just manually begin digging up all over this entire property in hopes of finding their friend and the rest of these people that were trapped underground. But they never did. And so we don't know what happened to Lanre and the other people who were trapped in that underground cell. We don't know what happened to the other 2 Okada riders who went missing right before Lanre did, although it's generally assumed they most likely were kidnapped as well and probably met a similar fate. We also have no idea how many people were butchered inside of the Soka Forest warehouse. However, given the massive amount of clothing and shoes inside of that black shack, it's believed the total number of victims is easily in the hundreds. No one has ever been officially held accountable for the atrocities that took place in the Soka Forest. However, a couple of days after the warehouse was discovered by the Okada posse, the posse was back digging, looking for Lanre, when they discovered there was this man who was there, who was kind of walking around, acting suspicious, and so the posse confronted him, and it would turn out this guy had several human tongues in his pockets, along with dozens and dozens of cell phone SIM cards. And so, assuming he was part of whatever happened there, the Okada posse proceeded to kill the man on sight. Later on, a woman who was a survivor from the warehouse would tell reporters how she got kidnapped. She said she lived in Ibadan, she was well educated, she had a good family, she was just sitting outside of her house when all of a sudden this van pulled up in front of her, and these very official looking men were inside of this van, and they got out and they told her, you're under arrest, you gotta come with us to the police station. And the woman was so confused, but the men were very professional and seemed very convincing, and so she got inside the van, they shut the door, and they drove off. And very quickly, once she was inside of the van and couldn't go anywhere, she realized they were not police. She had been kidnapped, and within the hour, she, along with several other people who had probably been kidnapped in the same way, were stripping their clothes off right outside of that black shack on the other side of the river, and they were told to put their clothes and belongings inside of the shack while they were being held at gunpoint, and then once they were naked, they were promptly marched into that warehouse where virtually everyone around her would be butchered and killed. On a warm summer night in 1998, a 7-year-old boy named Tyler Florian fell asleep watching TV on his living room couch. Tyler lived with his parents as well as his older brother, Will, who was 10 years old, in a modest 2-story home in a rural neighborhood in West Virginia. That night, Tyler's father, who normally tucked the boys in at night, was out for work. And so after Tyler fell asleep, it was his mother who gently woke him up and encouraged him to head upstairs to his room. And so Tyler, he gets off the couch and he's groggy and he makes his way over to the stairs. He climbs up the stairs and he turns right and heads down the hallway to his room. He goes into his bedroom, he climbs into his bed, and then he falls asleep. In order to understand what happens next, you need to have a good understanding of the layout of the second floor hallway. That hallway stretched from the front of the house all the way to the back of the house. And at either end of this hallway were doors that led outside of the house, and these doors had big windows on them. The front of the house, that door, if you walked out it, you'd be walking out onto a balcony that overlooked the front yard of the property. But if you walked out the back door of this second floor hallway, you would not be walking onto a balcony. You would not even be on the second floor. You'd be basically stepping into the backyard of the house. And the reason for this is because the house was built into a hill. And so the back half of the house is literally underground. It's in the hill. And so there is no door on the lower half of the house because there's just earth behind the door. And so it's that second floor doorway at the end of the hall that serves as kind of like the exit to the backyard of the house. So with that in mind, Tyler, he gets upstairs, he goes to his bedroom, which is towards the front half of this hallway, and he falls asleep. And then only about an hour after falling asleep, he wakes up to the sound of someone using the bathroom. Tyler's bedroom was positioned right across the hall from the bathroom, and his door was open, and so Tyler's laying on his bed, he opens his eyes, and he's looking through his open door at the bathroom, and the door is shut, but he can see there's light coming out from underneath the bottom of the door, so he knows someone's in there, and so Tyler's just laying there watching whoever is in there. He's assuming it's his brother, who has a habit of going to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and so he's just kind of watching, and then at some point he hears the flick of the light as it's turned off, and he sees the light disappear from inside of the bathroom. The door swings open, and sure enough, it's his brother who steps back into the hallway. His brother looks into Tyler's room, but doesn't attempt to interact with Tyler. Instead, Will just turns and walks back down the hallway towards his bedroom. And so as Tyler is listening to the sound of his brother's footsteps fade down the hallway, he closes his eyes again and prepares to go back to sleep. But as he's laying there with his eyes closed, he can tell that his brother has stopped short of his bedroom and has turned around and is now walking back up the hallway towards the bathroom and towards Tyler's room. And so Tyler opens his eyes again because he knows his brother is about to be right in front of his bedroom, and he's thinking, okay, maybe he forgot something in the bathroom. And so Tyler decides to just watch to see what his brother does. And so sure enough, Will walks all the way up until he's standing right in front of Tyler's open door. But instead of going into the bathroom, Will walks into Tyler's room. And right away, Tyler sits up and says, hey, what are you doing? What's going on? And his brother, he pauses for a second and he begins to say something that sounds like he saw something out there, but he's hesitant. He doesn't really know how he wants to frame the thing he wants to say. And so Tyler's like, come on, what are you doing? It's the middle of the night. What's going on? And finally, Will just blurts out, I keep seeing a man wearing stripes at the end of the hallway. And so Tyler, he hears this and he can't compute what he's being told. And so he just says, what? What are you talking about, Will? What did you see in the hallway? And Will would say again, I keep seeing a man wearing stripes at the end of the hallway. I've seen him a couple times in the last couple of days. I go to the bathroom, and then when I start walking back, I see him outside the back door in our backyard. And so Tyler is so scared because his brother does not sound like he's making a joke. His brother sounds like he's telling the truth. And just the fact that his brother can't quite find the words to describe what he saw made it seem even more real. And so Tyler, he gets out of bed and he says, Will, we got to go tell Mom. But that required going into the hallway and going down the hall towards where apparently this man in stripes was to get to their mother's bedroom. And so Will, who initially was not that scared of this man in stripes he had seen, was now starting to get pretty panicked in seeing Tyler's reaction to this. And so Will tells Tyler, stay right there, stay in the room. And so Will, he kind of peeks back into the hallway and he looks all the way down, and there is no man in stripes anymore. There's no one in the hall. And so he tells Tyler Tyler, the coast is clear, and the two of them run down the hallway all the way right in front of that door that leads into the back of the property where the man in stripes was, and they turn left and they go into their parents' bedroom where just their mother was because their father was out of town. And so they charge in there, they wake their mom up, and they're talking over each other, trying to communicate to their mom that there was a ghost, that there was an intruder, that there was something bad happening around their house. And so finally their mom just tells them to be quiet, and she says, okay, boys, sit on the bed. I'm gonna go have a look around the house. And so the two boys do as they're told. They sit on the bed, and their mom leaves the bedroom. She goes into the hallway, and she looks immediately to her left where the man in stripes supposedly was, and she doesn't see anything. She just looks out into their backyard. There's nothing there. She looks down the other direction, out the front of the house, doesn't see anything. She walks all around the house. She goes outside. She looks everywhere, but she doesn't see anyone or anything. And so eventually she comes back inside the house. She goes up to the second floor. She goes back to her bedroom, and she tells her boys, look, you probably just spooked yourselves. There is no man in stripes. You're totally safe. You're totally fine. Just go back to bed. You probably just imagined whatever you saw. And so Will, who was the one who saw the man in stripes, was very quick to accept his mother's answer. It actually seemed like it was a relief to have somebody tell him that what you had seen wasn't real. And so he very happily went back to his bed and he fell asleep. But Tyler, who had not seen the man in stripes, but had a very intense reaction to hearing his brother describe it, could not accept his mother's answer. It just totally freaked him out because his brother was always joking around about stuff, but this did not feel like a joke. This felt very, very real. But over the course of the next couple of days, weeks, months, years, Will never claimed to see the man in stripes again, and so pretty quickly, Tyler forgot about it. Fast forward 11 years to 2009, so Tyler is now 18 years old, and he and his mom were out in the car running some errands. And as they're driving around, they were just chatting about all sorts of different things, and at some point, they began talking about one of their beloved family pets, a dog named Max that they had when Tyler was really young. And so as they're kind of swapping stories about all the goofy things that this dog did, Tyler's mom suddenly says, hey, Tyler, do you remember the time that I opened the front door to let the cops into the house, and Max came bounding into the house, and he went right into the kitchen and he ripped open all the food? And Tyler's looking at his mom like, wait, when did the cops come to our house? When did you open the door to let the cops come into our house? And as soon as Tyler said this to his mom looked at him as if she had just given away something she hadn't meant to. And then she kind of relaxed and said, you know what? I never got around to telling you. Now that I'm thinking about it, you and your brother were asleep and you didn't even know this happened. And then afterward, me and your father decided not to tell you guys because we didn't want to scare you. Back when you were about 7 years old and Will was about 10 years old, your dad was away at work and we were all asleep one night when suddenly I wake up to the sound of someone or something moving around outside of our house. And so I sit up in bed and I go into the hallway and I look left and I look out that door into our backyard and I see standing up against the glass this man with his hands pressed to the window looking into the house. And so Tyler's mom would tell him how she totally freaked out and she flipped on the lights and it scared this guy who ran off, and then she called the police, and then the police showed up, and that's when their dog Max came bounding inside and shredded the bag of food. And the police, they searched the property, but apparently they never found this guy. Tyler's mom would go on to tell him that the police warned her that her description of this man that was standing at their back door matched the description of a man who was wanted for murder who was on the loose in the area. Tyler was dumbfounded. He didn't remember this because obviously he had been asleep because this is something he would have remembered. And so he had so many questions about this whole situation. But the first question he asked his mom was, well, what did he look like? And his mom said, well, he was tall, he had dark hair, he had blue jeans on, and oh, you know what? He had a striped shirt on. It would turn out for a couple of days in the summer of 1998, this suspected murderer who was on the run from police had apparently been hiding out on Tyler's family's property. And in the middle of the night, for whatever reason, this suspected murderer would walk over to the back door of the second floor hallway and he would put his face up to the glass and he would stare into their home. This was the man in stripes that Will claimed to have seen. He was real. Tyler, after making this connection, would follow up with his family members and he would do some digging of his own, but he was never able to figure out who the man in stripes was or what happened to him.